Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. This evening we journey deep into the frozen heart of Alaska, uncovering chilling accounts that most would never dare to speak aloud. Tonight's episode promises not only tales of horror but glimpses into the realities faced by those who call Alaska's remote small towns home. Each story you are about to hear is anchored in first-hand testimony, gathered from individuals scattered across America and carefully brought to life from the disturbing memories that still haunt them. The authenticity of these accounts has been treated with utmost respect, and while some names and identifying details have been changed to protect those involved, the terror remains untouched. Prepare yourself for 8 of the most disturbing true experiences ever reported from Alaska's wilderness. If you have not joined the Buried Files community yet, remember to subscribe for new true horror stories every week. Activate the notification bell so you are always first to hear when another file is unearthed. Jolene Hawthorne had always been captivated by the idea of flight. Growing up in the flat plains of Minnesota, she would often lie beneath the open sky for hours, watching prop planes and commercial jets leave their long trails in the blue expanse above. From a young age, she knew her dreams were tethered to the clouds, destined to soar beyond the grounding earth. It was her passion and escape, a desire to see the world from a vantage point few others ever experienced. After years of diligent study and careful accumulation of flight hours, Jolene finally earned her pilot's wings. She began flying short regional hops around the Midwest, hauling cargo and learning the rigorous discipline demanded by the skies. But she soon realized that her true calling beckoned further north, to remote lands where flying was not just a profession but a lifeline. Her new post was in Alaska, flying supply missions into some of the most isolated villages on the continent. These communities depended on people like her to bring them essentials during the months when the Arctic winter held the land in its icy grip. Roads froze over or disappeared entirely beneath snowdrifts and ice, and the seas turned too treacherous for boats. In Kotzebue, a small Inupiat village hugging the edge of the Chukchi Sea, Jolene's flights were crucial to survival. She was no stranger to the brutal Arctic environment. She had trained extensively in cold weather survival, learned to anticipate sudden weather changes, and mastered the intricate dance of flying in low visibility, piercing snow and sub-zero temperatures. Each flight was a challenge of skill, nerve, and endurance. The isolation never bothered her much. She had always been comfortable in her own company, and the compensation for Arctic flying made the hardships worthwhile. This particular January morning dawned with an icy stillness that Jolene found almost unnerving. The sun barely broke the horizon, casting a faint, pale light that seemed swallowed by heavy clouds. Temperatures hovered at 30 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, and the snow hung frozen, glittering faintly in the sparse daylight like countless tiny diamonds scattered across the landscape. Her aircraft for the supply run, a reliable de Havilland Beaver, was stocked fully with barrels of heating fuel, necessary to keep homes warm during the relentless cold. Crates of preserved food supplies, boxes of medical necessities including antibiotics and vaccinations, and small luxuries like children's books, batteries, and educational materials. Each crate represented lives dependent on her for survival. The weight distribution was perfect, fuel tanks topped off, and weather reports showed manageable conditions for the 3-hour flight north. Approaching the Kotzebue airstrip was usually a welcome sight, a sign of familiar faces and bustling life. The village council always arranged for workers to meet the supply flights, and children would often gather to watch the plane land, their breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. Yet when Jolene touched down that day, she was met with an unnerving silence. Gone were the usual workers unloading freight, the dogs barking in greeting, the murmur of the village waking after another night of Arctic darkness. Jolene's heart hammered with an unsettling foreboding as she disembarked, the cold numbness of the air pressing against every inch of exposed skin. She breathed deeply, the chill air stinging her lungs, half expecting the usual warmth of life around her, but instead greeted only with oppressive, unnatural quiet. The wind that typically carried sounds of daily village life, children calling to each other, adults discussing the day's tasks, sled dogs yipping, was absent. With the sled hooked behind the plane, Jolene began hauling her cargo across the runway toward the town center. The snow-crusted paths lay deserted, footsteps muffled beneath fresh snowfall. Houses, though neat and orderly, showed signs of abandonment, curtains still drawn back as if residents had left suddenly, coats dangling on hooks by doorways, untended fires reduced to cold ash in stone hearths. Smoke should have been rising from every chimney in weather this cold, but the sky remained clear. A soft whisper of wind stirred through the trees, carrying nothing but a chilling sense of absence. Jolene called out, her voice fragile in the vast stillness. "Is anyone here? We have supplies. Help has arrived." But no reply answered her desperate plea. The echo of her own voice seemed to mock her from the empty buildings. The grocery store was the next stop. Usually alive with the daily rhythms of the village, today it stood frozen in time. The front doors were thrown open as if escape had been sudden and urgent. Shelves remained undisturbed, stocked with canned goods, and the smell of stale air lingered. A tattered newspaper lay scattered on the floor, dated 2 weeks previous. Money still sat in the cash register, and a half-eaten sandwich on the counter had begun to mold. Trying to reach the council office via radio offered no comfort. Only static hissed back in response. Her emergency frequencies produced nothing but white noise. Her concern deepened, but training pushed her forward. In situations like this, protocol demanded a thorough search before declaring an emergency. Pressing on to the community center, Jolene found chaos stark and still. Overturned chairs and scattered papers whispered of hasty departure. A calendar on the wall remained frozen on December with no markings beyond the 15th. Her flashlight beam captured frozen snapshots of a life abruptly halted. Coffee cups still sitting on tables, meeting notes scattered on the floor, a child's drawing of a polar bear taped to one wall. Suddenly, a door upstairs slammed sharply, echoing through the empty halls. Jolene's heart pounded against her chest as she ascended cautiously, flashlight beam dancing nervously ahead of her. The rooms were empty save for scattered personal effects. Books left open, a doll lying face down on a cracked floorboard, winter clothes strewn about as if people had dressed quickly. On one wall, a solitary note caught her eye, its message smeared but unmistakable. "We fled into the storm. The shadow is coming. Do not follow us into the dark." A shiver of dread ran through her that had nothing to do with the cold. What shadow? And what kind of storm had forced the villagers to abandon their homes so suddenly, leaving behind everything they owned? She pressed on, venturing to the more remote surrounding homes, hoping to find someone who could explain what had happened. Here, signs of sudden departure were even more telling. Abandoned snowmobiles half buried in deep drifts, sleds tipped on their sides with supplies scattered in the snow, and children's toys left strewn as though the owners had been called away mid-play. Some houses had doors standing wide open, letting in the killing cold that would have frozen any remaining pipes within hours. Through the biting cold, her breath a dense cloud, Jolene noticed fresh footprints that were unbroken by new snow. The tracks led away from Kotzebue's center and stretched toward the frozen shoreline, a narrow path carved across the ice. The footprints were deep and hurried, as if made by people running in panic. Despite the gnawing pit of fear in her stomach, instinct and compassion urged her to follow. Perhaps some villagers had sought shelter in the fishing huts along the shore. Perhaps they were waiting for rescue, trapped by circumstances beyond their control. The air shifted as she reached the ice. The vast expanse of the Chukchi Sea reflected the shimmering aurora dancing in green and violet ribbons across the sky. It was both breathtaking and haunting, a surreal backdrop to the mystery before her. The aurora seemed unusually active, casting an otherworldly glow that made the ice appear to pulse with its own inner light. From behind a weathered fishing shack, a figure materialized. Pale and trembling, yet profoundly alive, the man seemed haunted by the elements and the solitude alike. His clothes were tattered, face gaunt from hunger and exposure, but his eyes held a desperate relief at seeing another human being. I was waiting, he whispered, voice cracked from cold and exhaustion. Everyone else, they fled into the storm and never came back. I stayed behind, hoping someone would come, hoping the supply plane would arrive. His name was Isaac, a local fisherman who had become separated during a sudden and violent blizzard that had descended upon the village 2 weeks prior. The storm had not been typical, he relayed between chattering teeth. It brought with it a darkness that was almost tangible, a shadow moving with the wind, stalking the village streets like something alive and malevolent. Isaac described how the shadow seemed to drive people mad with fear, corralling the frightened villagers and forcing them to flee into the wilderness where many succumbed to the unrelenting cold. Those who tried to resist or hide were found the next morning, dead but unmarked, as if their life force had simply been drained away. Jolene tended to him, wrapping the thin man in soft blankets from her emergency kit and sharing water and food from her pack. His story chilled her more than the Arctic wind, but she focused on the immediate need to keep him alive until help could arrive. Her mind reeled but focused. Understanding the gravity of the situation, she radioed the Kotzebue airport to request emergency medevac assistance. The voice that answered was strained and worried. Other pilots had reported strange atmospheric disturbances in the region, and several aircraft had gone missing in recent weeks. The answer was grim and urgent. Worsening weather conditions meant rescue efforts would be delayed. High winds and whiteout conditions had already grounded other flights, and the medevac helicopter would not be able to reach them until the storm front passed, possibly not until the following afternoon. Jolene refused to surrender to hopelessness. She had trained for situations like this, though never one quite so bizarre. Her survival instincts kicked in, and she began preparing for a long, cold night in the fishing hut. Throughout the long, bitter night, she kept a small fire burning inside the fishing hut, her senses sharp for any sign of danger. Every slight noise made her heart leap, the brittle snap of a branch outside, the whispered brush of snow against the window, the occasional groan of the hut's wooden frame settling in the cold. Her imagination painted sinister shapes just outside the fragile circle of firelight, and Isaac's mumbled warnings about the shadow did nothing to calm her nerves. The feeling of being watched was constant, gnawing at her calm. Several times she thought she glimpsed movement through the frosted windows, but when she peered outside with her flashlight, nothing was there except swirling snow and the dancing aurora overhead. As dawn's pale fingers finally crept over the horizon, a distant thrum shattered the silence. The whop-whop of helicopter blades sliced through the cold air, growing steadily louder until the bright orange rescue aircraft appeared through the morning haze. Isaac was rescued, carried into the safety of warmth and medicine, his frostbitten hands and feet requiring immediate medical attention. As the helicopter lifted off, Jolene took a final lingering look at the village. Kotzebue stood lost and silent, a ghost of itself beneath the pale Arctic sun. The tale of the last supply run spread quickly, whispered among pilots and locals alike as a warning. Aviation authorities launched an investigation but found no rational explanation for the village's abandonment. Search teams sent to look for the missing villagers found only scattered remains in the wilderness, victims of exposure and the brutal cold. Many avoided flying into Kotzebue after dark, wary of the shadow said to haunt its streets, a malevolent force consuming land and life. The village was eventually declared uninhabitable and removed from official flight schedules, though some say lights can still be seen there on certain nights when the aurora is particularly active. Though Jolene moved on to less taxing routes in milder climates, her experience remained etched in her mind, a stark reminder that nature's wilderness holds secrets and dangers no one should underestimate. She never flew in Alaska again, and whenever anyone asked her why she had left such a lucrative position, she would simply say that some places are better left undisturbed. Some shadows do not fade with the coming dawn, and some mysteries are too dangerous to solve. The last supply run taught her that there are forces in the world that human understanding cannot fully grasp, and sometimes the wisest course of action is simply to flee and never look back. Rodriguez Rod Espinoza was never one to believe much in the strange or supernatural. Growing up in the sprawling deserts of West Texas, his life was grounded in practicality, working the oil fields by day and fixing fishing boats at night. His hands were calloused from years of hard work, his face weathered by the harsh southwestern sun, and his worldview shaped by the reliable predictability of machinery and honest labor. When an opportunity came to work in Alaska as a commercial fisherman, he jumped at the chance, eager for a fresh start and an adventure he could brag about back home in the bars of El Paso. Nome was unlike anything Rod had ever experienced. The vast white plains of frozen sea stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the occasional cluster of fishing huts and the jagged silhouette of distant mountains that rose like ancient sentinels against the pale sky. The midnight sun was a strange companion during the summer months, casting an ever-present glow that blurred day into night and left Rod's internal clock completely confused. But it was during the harsh winter months that he truly began to understand the mystique of this remote place. It was here that Rod learned of Nome's annual ice fishing contest, a beloved tradition that brought together the scattered fishing community during the harshest season of the year. The contest was not just about catching fish. It was a celebration of survival, endurance, and the unbreakable bonds that held the community together when the outside world seemed impossibly far away. At first, Rod was hesitant to participate. The locals eyed him as an outsider, their weathered faces skeptical of his lack of experience in the frigid Arctic waters. His Texas drawl stood out sharply against their clipped northern accents, and his techniques honed on warm water species seemed clumsy and ineffective on the frozen Bering Sea. But his determination and natural fishing skill eventually won him grudging acceptance among the tight-knit group of fishermen and women who made their living from these unforgiving waters. The tournament was a grueling test of endurance and technique. Competitors had to drill through several feet of solid ice using hand-cranked augers, the work exhausting in the extreme cold. They had to brave the constant Arctic wind that could freeze exposed skin in minutes, and they had to possess the patience to wait for elusive catches in conditions that would drive most people indoors. The fish that lived beneath the ice, cod, burbot, and Arctic char, were prized not just for their size, but for their ability to thrive in this harsh environment. The day of the contest dawned with crystal-clear skies and bitter cold that made the air itself seem to crackle with electricity. The temperature registered at 42 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground. The air smelled of wood smoke mixed with sea salt, carried on winds that swept across hundreds of miles of frozen tundra before reaching the coast. Bundled in thick layers of caribou fur and modern insulated gear, Rod joined a crowd of fishermen and women, their faces already reddened by the cold, but their eyes bright with excitement and competitive spirit. Throughout the morning, Rod marveled at the skilled hands around him. Veterans who could read the ice like a book, knowing exactly where to drill and how deep to set their lines. These were people who had learned their craft from parents and grandparents, knowledge passed down through generations of Arctic survival. Conversations drifted between friendly banter about past catches and hushed warnings about the sea's deeper secrets. Stories were shared of strange happenings beneath the ice, whispered rumors and folklore passed down through generations like cautionary tales around a campfire. Old Henrik, a Norwegian fisherman who had been working these waters for 30 years, told Rod about the Sila, ancient Inuit spirits that were said to control the weather and the sea. "The ice has memory," Henrik said, his breath forming white clouds as he spoke. "It remembers every soul that has passed through these waters, and sometimes it calls to them." Rod chuckled quietly to himself, dismissing the tales as the superstitions of isolated people who had spent too many long winters in darkness. He was a man of reason and practical experience, and the frozen world offered no place for old wives' tales and supernatural nonsense. Yet as the contest progressed into the afternoon, a palpable shift occurred in the atmosphere around them. The ice beneath their feet started to hum softly at first, a low vibrational drone that seemed to resonate through their boots and into their bones. The sound was almost subliminal, felt more than heard, like standing too close to massive electrical transformers. Fishers paused in their work, casting nervous glances toward one another, their eyes drawn to the frozen surface with dawning unease. Rod felt the unsettling vibration too, a faint tremor that seemed to quicken and pulse beneath the vast frozen sea. It reminded him of the way the ground would shake when heavy machinery passed by the oil rigs back in Texas, but there was no machinery here, nothing but ice and water and the endless expanse of the Arctic wilderness. Suddenly, without warning, fishing lines began to jerk taut with a ferocity that sent spools flying off reels and knocked several fishermen off their feet. Rod gripped his rod with both hands, feeling an enormous weight on the other end of his line. He pulled hard, expecting to haul up the largest cod of his life. But what emerged from the black water beneath the ice defied all reason and explanation. Entwined upon his line was a grotesque creature that seemed to be composed of equal parts fish and living shadow. Its skin was mottled black and slimy, glistening unnaturally in the pale sunlight as if covered in some kind of phosphorescent slime. The thing's eyes glowed with a cold alien light that seemed to pierce straight through to Rod's soul. As the creature writhed on his hook, it emitted a guttural, mournful groan that sounded disturbingly like human speech, though in no language Rod had ever heard. Chaos erupted across the frozen fishing grounds. Lines snapped under impossible strain. Ice augers and tackle boxes were abandoned as their owners fled in terror, and men and women who had faced down polar bears and survived Arctic storms scrambled for safety like frightened children. Strange shapes began to emerge from the water beneath the ice, creatures that seemed to be part fish, part living shadow, moving beneath the frozen surface like phantoms with glowing hollow eyes that tracked the fleeing fishermen with malevolent intelligence. The temperature seemed to drop even further as whispers and cries rose from the assembled crowd. Chilling voices echoed from the depths beneath them, speaking in an eerie chorus of lament and warning that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The words were unintelligible but filled with such profound sadness and rage that several of the fishermen began to weep uncontrollably, overwhelmed by emotions that were not their own. Rod stood rooted in place by absolute terror, his rational mind unable to process what he was witnessing. The howl of the Arctic wind was completely drowned out by the supernatural chorus of moans and whispers rising from beneath their feet. The ice itself began to groan and crack under the weight of whatever was trying to push through from below, the sound echoing their own primal fear and threatening to give way to the hungry darkness of the sea. The voices seemed to be telling stories, fragments of lives cut short, tales of drowning and freezing and being pulled down into the depths by something that should not exist. Rod could almost make out individual words in the chaos, names and pleas for help from people who had died in these waters decades or even centuries ago. Panic overtook the entire crowd, and they fled toward the safety of the distant shore, leaving behind expensive gear and a lifetime's worth of fishing dreams. Snowmobiles roared to life and raced across the ice, some carrying multiple passengers who clung desperately to avoid being left behind with whatever had awakened beneath the frozen surface. Rescue teams arrived several hours later, dispatched by concerned family members when the fishermen failed to return at the expected time. What they found was nothing but frozen silence stretching across the Bering Sea. The ice was smooth and unmarked, bearing no sign of the terror that had driven an entire community into panicked flight. The abandoned fishing equipment had already begun to freeze solid, and the holes that had been drilled through the ice showed no signs of the unnatural creatures that had emerged from them. Local authorities dismissed the incident as a case of mass hysteria brought on by extreme cold and isolation, though they could not explain why experienced Arctic fishermen would abandon thousands of dollars worth of equipment without cause. The official report mentioned possible methane emissions from the seafloor causing hallucinations, but privately the investigators admitted they had never seen anything like it. The elders of the community whispered of the ice claiming more than fish that day. It had claimed their faith in the natural order of things and their understanding of what was possible in this world. Some spoke of ancient curses awakened by too much disturbance of the sea's depths, while others believed the spirits of those lost to the ice had finally found a way to make their presence known to the living. Rod left Alaska shortly thereafter, bearing psychological scars that would never fully heal. The nightmares started almost immediately. Dreams of black water filled with reaching hands and glowing eyes, of voices calling his name from beneath the ice. He sought treatment from doctors and therapists in Texas, but none could help him forget the sound of that otherworldly chorus or the sight of creatures that should not exist. The annual ice fishing contest in Nome was never held again. The community vote was unanimous. Some traditions were not worth the risk of awakening whatever slept beneath the frozen sea. The fishing grounds where the incident occurred were informally designated as off-limits, though no official warning signs were ever posted. Fishermen simply knew to avoid that particular stretch of ice, passing the knowledge along to newcomers as part of their informal education in Arctic survival. In the years that followed, other strange incidents were reported from the same general area. Pilots flying overhead claimed to see lights moving beneath the ice, and ships passing through the region during the brief summer months reported unusual sonar readings and equipment malfunctions. But these incidents were always isolated and quickly forgotten, dismissed as natural phenomena or equipment failure. Rod never returned to commercial fishing, instead finding work in construction back in Texas, where the ground stayed solid beneath his feet, and the only things lurking in the darkness were familiar and earthly. But sometimes, on particularly cold nights, he swears he can still hear those voices calling from beneath the ice, reminding him that some mysteries are too dangerous to investigate and some traditions too deadly to continue. The ice fishing contest that was supposed to bring the community together had instead revealed something that drove them apart, forcing them to confront the reality that their understanding of the world was incomplete and that some forces were beyond human comprehension or control. And deep beneath the frozen waves of the Bering Sea, the shadows continue to wait patiently for their next chance to surface, forever hungry and forever calling to those who dare venture too far onto the ice. Marcus Delacroix never expected to find himself in the middle of nowhere, Alaska, when he graduated with his communications engineering degree from Louisiana State University. But desperate times called for desperate measures, and the remote communications facility job in Bethel paid 3 times what he could make back home in Baton Rouge. The contract was for 18 months, maintaining the radio tower infrastructure that kept this isolated town of 4,000 connected to the outside world. What the job posting had not mentioned was that most of that work would be done alone during the endless Alaskan winter nights. The Bethel Communications Center sat 5 miles outside town, a squat concrete building surrounded by a forest of towering radio antennas that stretched up into the dark sky like metal fingers grasping at the aurora borealis. Marcus had been on the job for 3 weeks, learning the systems from his predecessor, a grizzled technician named Pete, who seemed eager to leave Alaska behind. Pete had been unusually quiet during the training period, showing Marcus the equipment with mechanical precision but offering little conversation beyond the technical requirements. On Marcus's final day of training, Pete finally opened up as they shared a thermos of coffee in the control room. The walls were lined with banks of radio equipment, their LED displays casting an eerie green glow in the dim lighting. Outside, the wind howled across the tundra, rattling the building's metal siding with a sound like distant applause. "Listen, Marcus," Pete had said, his weathered face serious in the electronic glow. "You are going to hear things up here that do not make sense." Radio waves bounce strange in this part of Alaska. Atmospheric conditions, northern lights, all sorts of scientific explanations for what might come through those speakers. He gestured toward the communication arrays. "But there are some transmissions you just need to ignore. Turn the volume down, log them as interference, and move on with your shift." Marcus had laughed it off at the time, assuming Pete was just trying to spook the new guy. But as the Louisiana native settled into his routine over the following weeks, he began to understand what Pete meant. The radio equipment picked up all manner of strange signals bouncing around the Alaskan atmosphere. Sometimes it was Russian military chatter from across the Bering Sea. Other times it caught fragments of conversations from aircraft flying overhead or ship-to-shore communications from vessels in the Bering Strait. Most nights, Marcus worked alone in the communications center from 10 p.m. until 6 a.m., monitoring the equipment and performing routine maintenance on the transmitters that kept Bethel connected to the outside world. The isolation never bothered him much. He had always been comfortable with his own company, and the job paid well enough that he could tolerate the loneliness for 18 months. He brought books to read during the quiet hours and had installed a small television in the break room to help pass the time. It was during his 6th week on the job that Marcus first heard the voice that would change everything. He was performing a routine check on the emergency communication frequencies when a woman's voice crackled through the static, clear as day, despite the poor signal quality. "This is Jennifer Walsh calling for help. My coordinates are 61.4 degrees north, 161.8 degrees west. I have been stranded here for 2 days. My snowmobile broke down and I need immediate assistance. Please respond if anyone can hear this transmission." Marcus immediately grabbed his logbook and started transcribing the message. Emergency calls were rare but not unheard of in the Alaskan bush, and it was his responsibility to relay any distress signals to the appropriate rescue services. He tried to respond on the same frequency, but the transmission seemed to be one way only. The woman repeated her message twice more before the signal faded back into static. Marcus spent the next 20 minutes trying to re-establish contact with the stranded woman while simultaneously calling the Alaska State Troopers to report the emergency. The coordinates she had provided placed her somewhere in the remote wilderness southwest of Bethel, an area known for its dangerous terrain and unpredictable weather conditions. The trooper on duty took down all the information and promised to dispatch a search team at first light. 3 days later, Marcus learned from the local newspaper that no rescue operation had found anyone at those coordinates. The search team had discovered the wreckage of a snowmobile, but it had been there for years, partially buried under snow and vegetation. More disturbing was the discovery they made while investigating the area more thoroughly. The remains they found nearby were identified as Jennifer Walsh, a wildlife researcher who had gone missing in that exact location 7 years earlier. Marcus tried to rationalize the experience. Radio waves could travel vast distances under the right atmospheric conditions. Perhaps he had somehow picked up an old transmission that had been bouncing around the ionosphere for years before finally reaching his equipment. It was a stretch scientifically, but stranger things had happened in the world of radio communications. But the rational explanations became harder to maintain as the weeks passed, and similar incidents occurred with increasing frequency. 2 weeks after the Jennifer Walsh transmission, Marcus heard another distress call during his night shift. This time, it was a man's voice, rough and desperate, identifying himself as Robert Cunningham. He claimed to be lost in a blizzard near the same general coordinates, begging for someone to send help before his supplies ran out. Marcus followed the same protocol, documenting the transmission and contacting the authorities. The next day, he learned that Robert Cunningham had been a geologist who disappeared in that area 5 years earlier. His body had been recovered months after his disappearance, along with evidence that he had indeed been caught in a severe blizzard and died of exposure. As winter deepened and the nights grew longer, the phantom transmissions became a regular occurrence. Marcus began to dread the overnight shifts, knowing that at some point during the dark hours, his equipment would pick up another desperate voice from the past. The calls always came from the same general area, always from people who had died years or even decades earlier in the remote wilderness southwest of Bethel. The most disturbing transmission came on a particularly cold February night when the temperature had dropped to 40 degrees below zero, and the aurora borealis painted the sky in ghostly green ribbons. Marcus was reading in the break room when the emergency frequency crackled to life with a transmission that made his blood freeze. "This is Marcus Delacroix calling for help. I am stranded at coordinates 61.4 degrees north, 161.8 degrees west. My vehicle has broken down and I am injured. Please send help immediately. I repeat, this is Marcus Delacroix requesting immediate assistance." The voice was unmistakably his own, though distorted by static and distance. Marcus listened in horror as his own voice repeated the distress call twice more before fading back into the white noise of the radio equipment. His hands shaking, he checked the transmission logs and confirmed that the signal had indeed come from the same coordinates where all the other phantom calls originated. Marcus spent the rest of that shift sitting in stunned silence, staring at the radio equipment and trying to process what he had heard. There was no rational explanation for receiving a distress call in his own voice from coordinates he had never visited. The implications were too terrifying to fully contemplate, but one possibility kept forcing its way into his thoughts. Were the transmissions predictions rather than echoes from the past? Was the radio equipment somehow picking up signals from people who were destined to die in that cursed patch of wilderness? The thought filled him with a dread so profound that he could barely function for the remainder of his shift. The next morning, Marcus drove straight to the airport and purchased the first available ticket back to Louisiana. He never returned to collect his belongings from the apartment in Bethel, and he never completed his 18-month contract with the communications company. The job was eventually filled by another technician from the lower 48, a young man from Ohio who lasted exactly 6 weeks before he too abandoned his post and fled Alaska without explanation. Marcus now works for a television station in New Orleans, safely surrounded by the familiar sounds and sights of his home state. But sometimes, late at night, when atmospheric conditions are just right, he swears he can still hear those phantom voices calling for help from the Alaskan wilderness. And he has never forgotten the sound of his own voice, desperate and afraid, calling out from coordinates he prays he will never visit. The communications center in Bethel has changed hands several times since Marcus left, but it continues to operate with a high turnover rate among overnight technicians. The local authorities no longer respond to emergency transmissions from the coordinates southwest of town, having learned that any rescue attempts in that area inevitably end in tragedy. The wilderness there remains empty and silent except for the phantom voices that continue to broadcast their eternal pleas for help into the cold Alaskan night. Destiny Washington had always been drawn to adventure, but nothing in her comfortable life in Washington, D.C. had prepared her for the brutal realities of seasonal work in Alaska. The 24-year-old political science graduate had signed up for a summer job at the Pacific Salmon Processing Facility in Ketchikan. Lured by the promise of good wages and the chance to experience the last frontier firsthand, what she discovered during the long Alaskan nights would haunt her for the rest of her life. The cannery sat on the edge of Tongass Narrows like a massive metal beast, its corrugated steel walls streaked with rust and salt spray. Built in the 1940s, the facility had processed millions of pounds of salmon over the decades, employing seasonal workers from all over the world who came north for the intense but lucrative fishing season. Destiny arrived in May when the daylight stretched nearly 20 hours and the air still carried the crisp bite of winter. Her supervisor, a gruff Alaskan native named Charlie Tutok, assigned her to the night shift on the processing line. The work was exhausting, standing for 12 hours straight, gutting and cleaning fish in the refrigerated facility while industrial machinery roared around them. But the pay was excellent, and Destiny found a certain meditative rhythm in the repetitive work, her hands moving automatically while her mind wandered. For the first month, everything seemed normal. The cannery operated around the clock during peak season, with 3 shifts of workers keeping the production line moving. Destiny worked alongside other seasonal employees, college students from the lower 48, immigrant workers sending money back to their families, and local Alaskans supplementing their incomes. The night shift was smaller and quieter, with only essential personnel maintaining operations while the fishing boats were out at sea. It was during her second month that Destiny began to notice the anomalies. She was working alone in the secondary processing area, a section of the cannery where fish were sorted and prepared for canning, when she heard the familiar sound of machinery starting up in the primary processing room next door. This was unusual since the primary line only operated when fresh fish were being brought in from the boats, and no deliveries were scheduled until morning. Curious, Destiny left her station and peered through the small window that connected the 2 areas. What she saw made her blood run cold. The massive processing conveyor was running at full speed, and salmon were moving down the line in perfect formation. But the facility had received no fresh deliveries in over 6 hours. The fish looked wrong somehow, their scales dull and lifeless, their eyes clouded with an oily film that caught the harsh fluorescent lighting in strange ways. She tried the door to the primary processing area, but it was locked from the inside. When she radioed her supervisor, Charlie told her that the primary line had been shut down hours ago and that no one else was in that section of the building. But Destiny could see the machinery running, could hear the rhythmic thump of fish dropping into processing bins, could smell the strong odor of salmon flooding through the ventilation system. The next night it happened again, and the night after that. Always during the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when Destiny was alone in her section of the cannery. the primary processing line would mysteriously come to life. She began keeping a detailed log of the incidents, noting the exact times, the sounds she heard, and the smells that accompanied the phantom operations. What disturbed her most was the fish themselves. During her daytime explorations of the facility, when she should have been sleeping in her cramped dormitory room, Destiny discovered that the processing bins in the primary area were always full of salmon after these mysterious night runs. But when she examined the fish more closely, she realized they were not from the current season's catch. The species were wrong. Varieties that had not been seen in Alaska waters for decades. The flesh was discolored and had a waxy texture that felt nothing like fresh fish. When she brought her concerns to Charlie, he dismissed them with an uncomfortable laugh. "Old buildings make strange noises," he said, avoiding her eyes. "Equipment runs on timers sometimes. You are just not used to the sounds yet." But Destiny noticed that he never volunteered to work the night shift himself, and when she pressed for more information about the cannery's history, he became evasive and changed the subject. It was Martha Kayahat, an elderly Tlingit woman who worked in the administration office, who finally told Destiny the truth. Martha had grown up in Ketchikan and remembered when the cannery was built, displacing a traditional fishing camp that had operated on the same site for hundreds of years. "My grandmother used to tell stories about that place," Martha said quietly, glancing around the empty break room to make sure they would not be overheard. "Before the whites came, our people caught salmon there every summer for generations. The spirits of the fish were honored, thanked for their sacrifice. Traditional protocols were followed to ensure the salmon would return each year." She paused to sip her coffee, her weathered hands trembling slightly. "When they built this place, they ignored all of that, tore down the sacred sites, poured concrete over the ceremonial areas, started processing fish like they were just commodities instead of living beings with spirits. My grandmother said the salmon spirits would not be ignored forever, that someday they would find a way to continue their ancient migration with or without our permission." Destiny felt a chill that had nothing to do with the refrigerated air. "You think the fish I am seeing are spirits?" Martha nodded solemnly. "The old salmon runs that used to come through here before overfishing and climate change disrupted everything. They are still following the ancient pathways, still trying to complete their life cycle. The cannery was built on top of their spiritual highway, but that does not mean they stopped using it." That night, Destiny decided to investigate more thoroughly. She positioned herself where she could observe the primary processing area directly and waited. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the machinery roared to life. But this time, instead of just watching through the window, Destiny used her security key card to unlock the connecting door. The sight that greeted her defied all rational explanation. The conveyor belt was indeed running, covered with salmon that moved with their own internal motion despite being obviously dead for decades. Their scales had the translucent quality of old bone, and their eyes glowed with a faint phosphorescent light. The smell was overwhelming, not the clean scent of fresh fish, but the musty, organic odor of something that had been underwater for far too long. As Destiny watched in horrified fascination, the ghost salmon moved through the processing equipment with mechanical precision. Cutting blades descended in rows, sorting mechanisms activated, and canning machines sealed products that should not have existed. But when she looked more closely at the operation, she realized that nothing was actually being cut or processed. The machinery went through all the motions, but the fish remained whole and untouched, as if the entire process was a kind of spiritual theater, an endless reenactment of their transformation from living creatures to commercial products. The most terrifying moment came when one of the ghost salmon on the conveyor belt turned its ancient head and looked directly at her. Its mouth opened and closed silently as if trying to speak. And Destiny heard something that might have been words carried on the recycled air of the facility. She could not make out the specific sounds, but the meaning was unmistakable. A mixture of sadness, anger, and an inexplicable longing for something that had been lost. Destiny backed slowly toward the door, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it over the roar of the machinery. As she reached for the handle, all the equipment suddenly stopped at once, plunging the facility into silence. The conveyor belt was empty, the processing bins were clean, and the overwhelming smell of ancient fish disappeared as if it had never existed. She quit her job the next morning, packing her belongings and booking the first flight back to Washington, D.C. Before she left, Martha Keahat sought her out and pressed a small carved pendant into her hand. A traditional salmon design carved from whale bone. "For protection," the elderly woman said, "in case they followed you home." For months after returning to D.C., Destiny was plagued by nightmares about glowing fish eyes and the sound of processing machinery running in empty buildings. She changed careers, abandoning her plans for graduate school in political science and instead pursuing a degree in indigenous studies, focusing on the intersection of traditional ecological knowledge and modern industrial practices. She never returned to Alaska, but she often wondered about the Pacific Salmon Processing Facility and whether the ghost salmon still ran their eternal processing line during the quiet hours of the night. In her research, she discovered that similar phenomena had been reported at industrial sites built on traditional hunting and fishing grounds throughout the Arctic, places where the old agreements between humans and the natural world had been forgotten or ignored. The carved salmon pendant that Martha had given her sat on Destiny's desk as she worked, a constant reminder that the boundaries between the living and the dead, between the past and the present, were far more permeable than most people realized. And sometimes, late at night, when she was working alone in her apartment, she would swear she could hear the distant sound of processing machinery and smell the unmistakable scent of ancient fish carrying messages from a world that modern society had tried very hard to forget. The spirits of the salmon continued their eternal migration, processing through facilities that existed in both the physical and spiritual realms, following pathways that had been established long before humans arrived on the continent and would continue long after the last cannery had rusted away. They were patient, persistent, and utterly indifferent to human schedules and industrial efficiency. They had work to do, ancient protocols to follow, and no amount of concrete or steel could stop them from completing their journey. Destiny Washington had learned that some jobs came with responsibilities that extended far beyond the terms of employment, and that some workplaces operated according to rules that were much older and more complex than anything covered in an employee handbook. The cannery continued to process its phantom catch every night, and somewhere in the endless cycle of spiritual fish moving through ghostly machinery, the old agreements were still being honored by beings that remembered when respect for the natural world was not just a philosophical concept, but a matter of survival. Kimiko Nakamura Williams had always believed that the world was deeper, stranger, and more mysterious than most gave it credit for. As a 29-year-old award-winning photographer from Portland, Oregon, she specialized in extreme landscape shots, preferring storms, mountains, volcanic fields, and the wildest, loneliest places she could find. But none of her adventures in the lower 48 compared to what Alaska had begun to mean to her. The land was Earth's memory, the sky a living canvas, and beneath it lived legends and darkness that no camera could fully capture. It was the third time she had come to Utqiagvik, the northernmost settlement in the United States, chasing the fabled auroras. This winter, storms had battered the coast for weeks, keeping most residents huddled indoors. Kimiko was restless. Her partner Samuel texted regular warnings from Anchorage. "Stay in the hotel, play it safe, the polar night is dangerous, you know the stories." But she had grown impatient, and after a particularly fierce blizzard finally cleared, Kimiko packed her camera bag, extra batteries, her tripod, thermal layers, 2 flasks of tea, and set out alone into the barren darkness of the North Slope's untamed tundra. To Kimiko, night in Alaska was not the simple closing of a curtain, but a transformation of reality. She trudged through powdery snowbanks, the ice crunching beneath her boots, her breath rising in shining clouds that danced in the pale glow of her headlamp. Out over the flat horizon, ribbons of green and violet shimmered through the thin clouds. Her first sign in days that the auroras were returning. All she wanted, she told herself, was one perfect shot. The northern lights twisting above a skeletal driftwood fence, the twin bluffs in the background, a faint glow on the horizon, some hint of the wild, cold stars above. She set up her tripod, checked her exposure, and waited, heart beating time with the silent pulse of the Arctic air. Around her, the silence was profound, a living, sentient thing. Hours passed in stillness. The auroras strengthened, swirling curtains climbing higher and burning more brightly. Kimiko clicked frame after frame, awed by the ever-shifting choreography overhead. But something was different tonight. The lights rippled in strange new ways, converging into arches so defined they looked almost unnatural, segmented like a stained glass window shattered across the sky. She zoomed in on her long lens, seeking detail. And behind the aurora, through it, she saw shadows, a flicker of movement that didn't belong. Long, spindly forms, deeper than black. Not the shadows of clouds or mountain, but figures tall as telephone poles with arms outstretched as though trying to tear through the veil of light. She blinked, wiped her lens for frost. For a moment, she convinced herself it was an illusion, tricks of the eye, perhaps pareidolia, the brain's desperate attempt to force pattern on cosmic chaos. But it happened again. Then again. Each photo, the outlines clear as ice crystal, the shadows moving as the aurora shifted, drifting closer to the foreground. Desperate to stay rational, Kimiko adjusted settings and extended her exposure. Her camera's screen flickered in the biting dark. She clicked, counted, clicked again. In the 10th frame, one of the shadows had come nearer to the camera than before. Now sharply defined, its face a hollow emptiness, arms angled as if reaching forward. A deep surge of terror crawled up her spine. They weren't tricks of technology. She felt it. A pressure like static electricity, as though the air itself turned sentient, humming quietly with menace. At that very moment, another subtler sensation began, a ringing in her ears, growing louder until it seemed to vibrate in her skull. Kimiko's vision pulsed at the edges. She tried to pack up, but her hands moved clumsily, her sense of balance off. The lights overhead quickened, dancing in frenetic spirals, illuminating not only the land but what now stood openly upon it. All around her, in the spaces where the aurora was brightest, the shadows stood, dozens, maybe hundreds, tall and gaunt, their forms semi-transparent but distinctly apart from the night. They pressed at the borders of the real, leaning in, the ground beneath them shimmering like disturbed puddles. Kimiko staggered backwards, falling to one knee. For a brief, nightmarish instant, the air itself seemed to split with an inaudible scream. Then, impossibly, the shadows began to move in her direction, sliding across the snow without disturbing a flake. In her mind, she heard a cacophony, dozens of distant, wordless voices full of longing and despair, each voice shaped like a memory she could not recall. She grabbed her camera, abandoning her tripod and nearly crawling back toward her snowmobile. Every few yards, she fought the urge to glance behind her, to see whether the silent figures had gained on her, but terror propelled her forward. When Kimiko reached her snowmobile, it would not start. The electronics flickered weakly, then died, as if the batteries had been drained by something pouring out of the sky. For long minutes, her only company was the crackling static of her nerves and the swirling luminance overhead. In desperation, she pulled out her emergency radio and attempted to call for help, but only a high, ghostly wail came through, mingled with what sounded like distant voices uttering unspeakable syllables. Sobbing, Kimiko huddled beside her pack, scanning her photos while her numbed fingers struggled to function. In every frame, the shadows had come closer, until one frame showed a face just outside her headlamp's glow, its features an agonizing ambiguity, perhaps pleading, perhaps hungry, perhaps both. For hours she sat there, listening to the auroras hum like the world's saddest violin, waiting for the dawn that would never come. In the Arctic winter, the sun rose only for a handful of moments each day and would not return in earnest for weeks. She drifted in and out of shivering sleep, haunted by visions of impossibly long arms reaching for her, by eyes she could never quite see. Eventually, morning brought a search party, a group of Utqiagvik locals who had seen her hastily abandon tripod and followed her snowmobile's tracks by headlamp and intuition. They found Kimiko shivering, eyes wild, clutching her camera like a lifeline. They bundled her onto their sled and sped her back to town, where elders muttered blessings against the spirits that stalked the dark tundra. When Kimiko processed her images weeks later in the safety of her hotel, the digital anomalies were still visible. Forms that should not be, faces that could not exist, each more defined at the places where the auroras raged brightest. She learned from the elders that the Inupiat have long believed the northern lights are more than just light. They are the spirits of the dead, or portals to other realms, or the veils of ancient ones who sometimes try to return when the sky opens wide. The villagers told her she had been lucky, or perhaps unlucky, to have come so close. When the sky dances most wildly, an old Inupiaq woman told her, never answer if you hear your name whispered, or the ones in the lights will find a way to pull you through. Kimiko left Utqiagvik with her art portfolio forever changed and her certainty forever shaken. For the rest of her life, she would avoid photographing auroras, unable to shake the feeling that something in the sky had seen her too, and might one day come looking for her when the darkness returned. Thomas Tom Begay had learned about respect from his grandmother long before he ever set foot in Alaska. Growing up on the Navajo Nation in Arizona, he was taught that the land held memories, that certain places demanded acknowledgement, and that ignoring the warnings of elders could bring consequences that lasted generations. When he moved north to pursue his dream of running the Iditarod, he carried those lessons with him, though he never expected to need them in quite the same way. Tom had always been drawn to sled dogs. There was something about their fierce loyalty, their incredible endurance, and their ability to navigate the most treacherous terrain that spoke to him on a fundamental level. After years of training in the lower 48, he finally saved enough money to purchase a team of experienced racing dogs from a musher outside of Fairbanks. The seller, an old Norwegian man named Eric, warned him about certain sections of the trail, but Tom assumed he was talking about natural hazards. Thin ice, sudden weather changes, areas prone to whiteout conditions. It was only later, after he had been living in Alaska for several months and had gotten to know some of the local Inupiaq elders, that he began to understand the deeper meaning behind Eric's warnings. The old Inupiat woman who ran the general store in town, Mary Kunguk, took a liking to Tom, perhaps recognizing a kindred spirit in someone who understood the importance of traditional knowledge. Over cups of tea during the long winter evenings, she began to share stories that her own grandmother had told her. Stories about places where the spirits of the dead still walked, where ancient things slept beneath the snow, and where even the bravest hunters feared to tread. "There are sections of the old trails," Mary told him one evening, her weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug, "where the Tornit once lived. The giant people, the ones who came before us, they were not evil, but they were not human either, and when they left warnings behind. The dogs know. They can smell the old anger, the old sadness. A wise musher listens to his dogs." Tom nodded politely, filing the information away as folklore. Interesting, but not immediately practical. He was focused on training, on building the stamina and teamwork necessary for the 1,000-mile race that would test everything he had learned about survival in the Arctic wilderness. His first real encounter with the supernatural came in late February, during what was supposed to be a routine training run along a section of the Iditarod Trail that wound through dense spruce forest about 50 miles northeast of his base camp. The weather was perfect for mushing, cold but not brutally so, with just enough wind to keep the dogs alert but not enough to create dangerous conditions. His team was running beautifully, moving in perfect synchronization across the packed snow, their breathing steady and their pace sustainable for the long haul. The lead dogs were Nanook and Koda, two experienced Siberian huskies who had run the Iditarod 3 times with their previous owner. They were intelligent, reliable, and had never given Tom any reason to doubt their judgment, which was why he was so surprised when they suddenly began to slow down, their ears flattening against their heads as they approached what looked like a perfectly ordinary section of trail winding between tall evergreens. At first, Tom assumed they had caught the scent of wildlife, moose perhaps, or a bear den. He called out encouragement, urging them forward, but instead of responding to his voice, both dogs came to a complete stop and began to whimper. The rest of the team bunched up behind them, and within moments, all 12 dogs were showing signs of extreme agitation. Tom set his snow hook and walked up to examine the trail ahead. To his eyes, there was nothing unusual, just the familiar ribbon of packed snow disappearing into the shadows between the trees. The forest was quiet except for the occasional creak of branches in the wind, and the air carried only the clean, sharp scent of snow and pine. But as he stood there trying to understand what had spooked his dogs, he began to feel it too, a subtle wrongness that made his skin crawl and sent his grandmother's warnings echoing through his memory. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly, though his thermometer showed no change. The wind died completely, leaving a silence so profound that his own heartbeat sounded thunderous in his ears. And then, from somewhere ahead in the forest, came a sound that made every nerve in his body scream in alarm. A low, rhythmic drumming that seemed to come from the earth itself. Tom's dogs began to howl in unison, a mournful sound that spoke of fear deeper than any natural instinct. Nanook was pulling against his harness, trying desperately to turn the team around, while Koda had dropped to his belly in the snow, trembling with terror. The other dogs were backing up, tangling their lines in their desperate attempt to retreat from whatever lay ahead. As the drumming grew louder, Tom began to hear other sounds layered beneath it, voices singing in a language he did not recognize, the scrape of bone against stone, and something that sounded disturbingly like massive footsteps moving through the forest. The air itself seemed to thicken, becoming harder to breathe, and the shadows between the trees began to move in ways that defied the pale light filtering through the canopy. Tom had heard enough stories from his grandmother about respecting the warnings of the spirits to know when he was in over his head. Without hesitation, he pulled up the snow hook and helped turn his terrified team around. The dogs needed no encouragement to run in the opposite direction. They took off at a pace that would have been dangerous under normal circumstances, racing back along the trail as if their lives depended on it. It was only when they had put several miles between themselves and that cursed section of forest that the dogs began to calm down. Tom stopped the team and checked each animal carefully, looking for signs of injury or distress, but aside from elevated heart rates and nervous panting, they seemed physically unharmed. What disturbed him more was the way they kept looking back along the trail, their ears pricked forward as if listening for sounds of pursuit. That evening, Tom drove into town and sought out Mary Kanguk. He found her at the community center where she was teaching traditional beadwork to a group of local children. When she saw his expression, she dismissed the class early and invited him to walk with her along the frozen shoreline of the lake. "You went to the forbidden place," she said before he had even begun to describe his experience. "I can see it in your eyes. The dogs warned you and you listened. That is good. That shows wisdom." Tom described what he had experienced, and Mary nodded gravely as he spoke. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. "That place has been forbidden for longer than anyone can remember," she finally said. "My grandmother's grandmother told stories of what happened there, back when the world was different. There was a village once, a prosperous place where people lived in harmony with the land and the spirits. But they grew proud, began to take more than they needed, began to ignore the old agreements with the Tornet and the other ancient people." She paused to pull her parka tighter against the wind. "The spirits tried to warn them just as your dogs warned you. But they would not listen. They said the old ways were foolish superstition, that they were strong enough to take whatever they wanted from the land without consequence. So the spirits withdrew their protection, and the Tornet came in the night, not to destroy, but to teach. They drummed the people into the earth, into the trees, into the stones themselves. The village disappeared, but the spirits remained still drumming, still trying to teach the lesson that pride and disrespect bring only sorrow." Tom felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic wind. "What happened to the people?" "They became part of the warning," Mary said sadly. Their voices joined the ancient song, adding their own sorrow to the chorus. "That is why the dogs fear that place. They can hear the voices of all who ignored the spirit's wisdom, and they know that some paths lead only to becoming lost forever." In the weeks that followed, Tom redesigned his training routes to avoid that section of the trail entirely. He also began to pay closer attention to his dog's instincts, learning to read the subtle signs that indicated when they sensed something beyond normal human perception. He discovered that there were several other areas along the traditional trails where his team would show similar signs of unease, though none as dramatic as that first encounter. When race day finally arrived, Tom's team performed beautifully, finishing in the middle of the pack. A respectable showing for a first-time Iditarod Musher. But what he remembered most about the race was not his finishing time or the physical challenges he had overcome. It was the moment, about 2/3 of the way through the race, when the trail took him near the forbidden section of forest. Even from miles away, his dogs began to show signs of nervousness. Nanook kept glancing toward the dark line of trees on the horizon, his ears swiveling as if picking up sounds that Tom could not hear. The entire team picked up their pace without any command from him, as if eager to put as much distance as possible between themselves and whatever slept in those shadows. Tom never ran the Iditarod again. He continued to train and race dogs on shorter courses, but something about that experience in the forbidden forest had changed his relationship with the wilderness. He had glimpsed something vast and ancient and utterly indifferent to human ambition, something that existed according to laws much older than the ones that governed his familiar world. He moved back to Arizona after a few years, where he started a program teaching traditional tracking and outdoor survival skills to young people on the reservation. He always began his classes the same way, with a story about the importance of listening to the warnings of elders, both human and animal. He never mentioned the specific details of what he had encountered in Alaska, but he made sure his students understood that the natural world contained forces that demanded respect, and that ignoring those forces came with consequences that could last for generations. The dogs had saved him by refusing to enter that place where ancient spirits still drummed their warnings into the frozen earth. Tom never forgot that lesson, and he made sure that everyone he taught understood it as well. Some places were meant to be avoided, some paths were not meant to be taken, and the wisdom to know the difference was often the thin line between survival and becoming another voice in the eternal chorus of the lost. The Tornets still walked in those dark woods, still drummed their ancient warnings into the night. And somewhere in the forest, the spirits of those who had ignored their wisdom continued to sing their mournful song, adding their voices to the eternal reminder that pride and disrespect for the old ways would always carry a terrible price. Tom Begay had learned to listen to his dogs, and in doing so had learned to listen to the land itself. It was a lesson he carried with him for the rest of his life. A reminder that true wisdom lay not in conquering the wilderness, but in understanding his place within it and respecting the boundaries that had been set by powers far greater than himself. Caleb O'Sullivan had always been driven by a deep sense of purpose. Growing up in South Boston in an Irish-American family that valued education above almost everything else, he had watched his parents work multiple jobs to put his older siblings through college. When it was his turn, Caleb chose education as his major, determined to make a difference in the lives of children who might not otherwise have access to quality schooling. After graduating from Boston College with his teaching degree, he applied for positions in remote areas where teachers were desperately needed. The offer from Nukumgak, a village of fewer than 200 people situated deep in the Alaskan bush, seemed like exactly the opportunity he had been looking for. The village was so remote that it could only be reached by small aircraft, and the previous teacher had left abruptly in the middle of the academic year without explanation. The school superintendent in Bethel had been honest about the challenges: extreme isolation, harsh weather conditions, and cultural barriers that could make teaching difficult for outsiders. But the salary was competitive, and the chance to make a real impact was undeniable. Caleb arrived in Nukumgak on a cold September morning when the tundra was already showing the first signs of winter's approach. The village consisted of a few dozen small houses clustered around a community center, a general store that also served as the post office, and the school, a modest two-room building that served children from kindergarten through 8th grade. The high school students were sent to boarding schools in larger towns, a practice that had created some tension in the community over the years. The school building itself was newer than most of the other structures in the village, built in the late 1990s with federal funding. It had modern heating, electricity powered by diesel generators, and internet access that worked when weather conditions permitted. Caleb's living quarters were attached to the school in a small apartment that had been designed for visiting teachers. It was sparse but comfortable, with a kitchenette, a sleeping area, and a small office where he could prepare lessons. His students ranged in age from 5 to 14, with a total enrollment of 18 children from 12 families. Most were Yupik, with a few mixed heritage students whose families had moved to the village from other parts of Alaska. Caleb had studied basic Yupik language and cultural practices during his preparation for the position. But he quickly realized that textbook knowledge was very different from the lived reality of teaching in a community where traditional ways of life were still very much alive. For the first few weeks, everything went smoothly. The children were initially shy around their new teacher, but Caleb's enthusiasm and genuine respect for their culture gradually won them over. He incorporated local knowledge into his lessons, asking elders to visit the classroom to share traditional stories and teaching methods. The parents seemed pleased with his approach, and he began to feel that he was truly making a difference. It was in early October that Caleb first noticed something unusual about his students' artwork. During a free drawing period, he observed that several of the children were creating remarkably similar images. Intricate patterns of spirals and geometric shapes that seemed far too sophisticated for their age levels. When he asked about the drawings, the children would look at each other nervously and mumble that they had learned the patterns from the other teacher. This confused Caleb, since he was the only teacher in the village, and the previous teacher had left months before any of these particular patterns had appeared in their work. When he asked for clarification, 10-year-old Mary Tulimak told him matter-of-factly that the night teacher shows us things when you go to sleep. Intrigued rather than alarmed, Caleb assumed the children were talking about some kind of cultural education that happened outside of school hours. Many indigenous communities had traditional teaching methods that operated parallel to formal education, and he respected the importance of those practices. He made a mental note to speak with some of the village elders about coordinating his curriculum with whatever traditional instruction the children were receiving. But as the weeks passed, the situation became more puzzling. The children began displaying knowledge of subjects that were far beyond their grade levels. Complex mathematical concepts, detailed understanding of astronomical phenomena, and most disturbing of all, the ability to write in what appeared to be a form of ancient script that none of the village elders could identify. The breakthrough came during a parent-teacher conference in late October. Caleb was meeting with Robert and Susan Akaran, the parents of 8-year-old Tommy, when he mentioned the boy's remarkable progress in mathematics. Tommy had begun solving algebraic equations that should have been incomprehensible to a third grader, and when Caleb asked him where he had learned these techniques, Tommy had given the same answer as the other children. The night teacher showed me. Robert and Susan exchanged worried glances. "There is no night teacher," Susan said quietly. "We thought Tommy was learning these things from you during regular school hours." That evening, Caleb decided to investigate. He waited in his apartment until he was certain the village was asleep, then quietly made his way into the main classroom. The school was dark and silent, heated only enough to prevent the pipes from freezing. He settled into a chair in the back of the room and waited, telling himself that he would probably see nothing more than shadows cast by the security lighting. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the classroom began to change. The temperature dropped noticeably, and a faint phosphorescent glow began emanating from the walls themselves. The desks and chairs rearranged themselves silently into a perfect circle, and symbols began appearing on the blackboard, the same intricate patterns that had been showing up in his students' artwork. Then they began to arrive, not through the doors or windows, but simply materializing in the classroom as if stepping through invisible doorways. They appeared to be children at first glance, but their proportions were subtly wrong. Too tall for their apparent age, with elongated limbs and faces that seemed both ancient and ageless. Their clothing was traditional Yupik style, but appeared to be made from materials that caught and reflected light in impossible ways. The phantom students took their places in the circle of desks and began to study the symbols on the blackboard. Their learning methods were unlike anything Caleb had ever witnessed. They absorbed information directly, without the need for repetition or explanation. Complex mathematical formulas, astronomical charts, and linguistic patterns flowed from the blackboard into their consciousness with perfect efficiency. Most disturbing of all was the realization that these spectral children were teaching his students. Real children began to appear in the classroom, not physically, but as translucent projections of themselves, still asleep in their beds but somehow present in this otherworldly classroom. Tommy Akaran was there, along with Mary Tulimak and most of Caleb's other students. They sat in the circle with the phantom children, learning the same impossible lessons with the same supernatural efficiency. Caleb watched in fascination and growing horror as the night school conducted its session. The subjects being taught were far beyond elementary level. Advanced mathematics, quantum physics, ancient history of civilizations that had never existed according to any textbook, and languages that predated human settlement of Alaska. The phantom teacher, who appeared to be an adult version of the same ethereal beings, communicated without speaking, transferring knowledge directly into the minds of both the spectral students and Caleb's real children. The session lasted for exactly 1 hour. At 3:17 a.m., the symbols faded from the blackboard. The desks returned to their normal positions, and both the phantom students and the projections of his real children dissolved back into darkness. Caleb sat alone in the empty classroom, shaking with cold and the implications of what he had witnessed. The next morning, he tried to act normally, but his students seemed to sense that something had changed. They watched him with knowing eyes, as if aware that he had discovered their secret education. Their schoolwork continued to display the same impossible advancement, but now Caleb understood the source of their knowledge. Over the following weeks, he tried to research the phenomenon, reaching out to colleagues, anthropologists, and experts in indigenous spirituality. Most dismissed his account as stress-induced hallucinations or cultural misunderstanding. A few suggested that he might be witnessing some form of ancestral teaching spirit, but none could offer concrete explanations for what was happening in his classroom. The children themselves were reluctant to discuss the night school, responding to his questions with nervous silence or vague statements about learning from the old ones. The village elders were equally evasive, though Caleb sensed that they knew more than they were willing to share with an outsider. The situation came to a head in November, when Caleb realized that the night school was changing his students in ways that went beyond advanced academics. They were becoming detached from normal childhood activities, more interested in abstract concepts than games or social interaction. Their artwork became increasingly alien, depicting landscapes and structures that existed nowhere on Earth. Most troubling of all, they had begun speaking in unison during regular class time, finishing each other's sentences with perfect synchronization as if they shared a collective consciousness. When Caleb tried to address this behavior, the children looked at him with expressions of pity rather than confusion. "You cannot understand yet," Mary Tulamak told him with the grave seriousness of someone much older than 10. "You are still learning the old way." The night teacher says some people take longer to receive the true knowledge. That night, Caleb decided to confront whatever was teaching his students. He entered the classroom before the 2:17 a.m. transformation and positioned himself directly in the center where the circle of desks would form. When the phantom children began to materialize, he stood his ground and spoke directly to their teacher. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What are you teaching them?" The spectral educator turned its attention to him for the first time, and Caleb felt its consciousness brush against his mind like cold fingers exploring the surface of his thoughts. When it spoke, the words formed inside his head rather than reaching his ears. "We are the ones who came before," the entity communicated. "We are the teachers of the deep knowledge, the wisdom that your people have forgotten. These children are chosen to carry the old learning into the new time. You may join them if you wish to understand." Caleb felt an overwhelming temptation to accept the offer. The knowledge being transmitted was incredibly seductive. Answers to questions that had puzzled humanity for millennia. Understanding of natural laws that could revolutionize human civilization. But something in the children's increasingly vacant expressions during daytime hours warned him that this education came with a price that might be too high to pay. "What will happen to them?" he asked. "They will become bridges between the worlds," the entity replied. "They will carry our wisdom to your people, when your people are ready to receive it. But first, they must be fully prepared. Caleb understood that fully prepared meant something far more profound than advanced education. The night school was transforming his students into something other than human, gradually replacing their individual consciousnesses with collective knowledge that served purposes he could not comprehend. The next morning, he submitted his resignation to the school district and arranged for emergency transportation out of Nukumgak. He left behind most of his belongings and all of his carefully prepared lesson plans. His official reason was a family emergency, but privately he knew he was fleeing something that threatened his sanity and possibly his soul. The replacement teacher lasted 3 weeks before also requesting emergency transfer. The school district eventually closed the Nukumgak facility, citing declining enrollment and budget constraints. The children were sent to boarding schools in Bethel, where their extraordinary academic abilities were noted but attributed to exceptional individual talent rather than supernatural intervention. Caleb returned to teaching in Massachusetts, but he never forgot the night school or the children whose minds had been opened to knowledge that was not meant for human understanding. Sometimes, late at night when he was grading papers or preparing lessons, he would remember the seductive offer of the phantom teacher and wonder what truths he had walked away from. He kept track of his former students through various channels over the years. Many went on to distinguished careers in science and academia, making discoveries and theoretical breakthroughs that advanced human knowledge in significant ways. But those who knew them personally often commented on their detached, otherworldly demeanor and their tendency to speak as if they were accessing information from sources beyond normal human experience. The night school continued to operate in Nukumgak, even without a formal educational facility. Local pilots reported seeing lights in the abandoned school building during winter nights, and occasionally hunters would encounter children in the wilderness who spoke in languages that had never been cataloged by linguists. The village elders maintained their silence, understanding that some forms of education were too dangerous for outsiders to comprehend. Caleb O'Sullivan had learned that teaching was not always about imparting knowledge to students. Sometimes it was about protecting them from knowledge that could fundamentally alter what it meant to be human. The line between education and transformation was thinner than most people realized, and crossing it meant entering a realm where the familiar boundaries of reality no longer applied. Dr. Priya Chatterjee Moore had always been fascinated by the extremes of human experience. As a climate researcher from the University of Michigan, she specialized in studying the psychological and physiological effects of extreme environments on isolated communities. When the National Science Foundation offered her a summer research grant to study the impact of the midnight sun on sleep patterns in remote Alaskan villages, she jumped at the opportunity. What she discovered during those endless bright days would challenge everything she thought she knew about the boundaries between the conscious and unconscious mind. The research station was located near Anaktuvuk Pass, a small Inupiaq village in the heart of the Brooks Range where the sun did not set for nearly 3 months during summer. The facility had been established in the 1980s to support various scientific studies of Arctic conditions, and it offered the perfect base for Dr. Chatterjee Moore's investigation into circadian rhythm disruption in extreme latitudes. Her research methodology was straightforward. Monitor the sleep patterns, dream activity, and psychological well-being of volunteers from the local community during the peak weeks of the midnight sun phenomenon. She had brought sophisticated EEG monitoring equipment, sleep study apparatus, and psychological assessment tools that would allow her to document the effects of continuous daylight on human consciousness. The village elder, Robert Aguk, had given permission for the study after lengthy discussions about its potential benefits to the community. Many residents had experienced sleep difficulties during the midnight sun period, and Dr. Chatterjee Moore's research promised to offer insights that might help future generations cope with the unique challenges of Arctic life. For the first 2 weeks, everything proceeded according to plan. Dr. Chatterjee Moore established her monitoring protocols, recruited a dozen volunteers ranging in age from teenagers to elders, and began collecting baseline data on their sleep patterns. The results were initially predictable. Most participants showed significant disruption to their normal circadian rhythms with fragmented sleep, increased REM activity, and reports of unusually vivid dreams. But as the study progressed into its 3rd week, when the sun remained perpetually overhead in the pale blue sky, something unprecedented began to emerge from the data. Dr. Chatterjee Moore noticed that her research subjects were not just experiencing disrupted individual sleep patterns. They were beginning to share dream content in ways that should have been impossible according to everything she understood about consciousness and neuroscience. The first indication came during her daily interviews with the participants. Sarah Kunalak, a 28-year-old teacher, described a recurring dream about walking through a vast ice cave filled with glowing symbols carved into the walls. When Dr. Chatterjee Moore interviewed 16-year-old Tommy Aguk later that same day, he described almost identical dream imagery, down to specific details about the arrangement of symbols and the quality of light within the cave. Initially, Dr. Chatterjee Moore assumed this was simply coincidence or perhaps the result of shared cultural imagery. Many indigenous communities had common mythological and spiritual symbols that might naturally appear in dreams. But as she continued collecting data, the shared dream experiences became too frequent and too specific to dismiss as cultural overlap. By the 4th week of the study, all 12 participants were reporting variations of the same core dream narrative. They described finding themselves in a vast underground chamber where dozens of people sat in perfect stillness, their eyes closed but their minds somehow active and aware. In the dreams, the participants could communicate without speaking, sharing thoughts and emotions with perfect clarity. Most disturbing of all, they began to recognize the other dreamers as their fellow research subjects, people they were meeting in some kind of shared unconscious space. Dr. Chatterjee Moore's EEG monitoring confirmed that something extraordinary was happening. During the hours when participants reported shared dreaming experiences, their brainwave patterns showed remarkable synchronization. The alpha and theta waves that typically indicated deep sleep states were occurring simultaneously across multiple subjects, even when they were sleeping in different locations throughout the village. The breakthrough came when Dr. Chatterjee Moore decided to monitor her own sleep patterns using the same equipment. As someone who had grown up in Michigan and had never experienced the midnight sun phenomenon, she expected to show different patterns from the local residents. Instead, she found herself drawn into the same shared dream space that her research subjects had been describing. The experience was unlike anything she had ever encountered in her scientific career. In the dream, she found herself standing in the vast underground chamber, surrounded by the sleeping figures of her research participants and dozens of other people she did not recognize. The space felt more real than reality itself, filled with a kind of crystalline clarity that made normal waking consciousness seem foggy and incomplete by comparison. In the center of the chamber stood a figure that seemed to be composed of pure light. Not the harsh brightness of the midnight sun, but a soft golden radiance that conveyed warmth and ancient wisdom. When the entity spoke, its words formed directly in Dr. Chatterjee Moore's mind rather than reaching her through her ears. "You have come to study the effects of endless light on the human mind," the entity communicated. "But you have discovered something far more significant. When the barriers between day and night dissolve, other boundaries become permeable as well. The midnight sun opens doorways that remain closed during the normal cycle of light and darkness. Dr. Chatterjee Moore found herself able to respond through pure thought. What kind of doorways? What is this place? This is the collective unconscious made manifest, the entity replied. A space where individual minds can meet and share experiences across the boundaries of physical existence. Your people call it dreaming, but it is more than that. It is a return to the original state of human consciousness, before you learn to separate yourselves from each other and from the deeper rhythms of the natural world. As the entity spoke, Dr. Chatterjee Moore became aware that she could perceive the thoughts and emotions of everyone else in the chamber. She felt the deep connection between the Inupiaq participants and their ancestral land, the way their consciousness was intimately linked to the cycles of Arctic life. She experienced the dreams of people she had never met, hunters and shamans and storytellers from previous generations who seemed to exist in this space outside of normal time. Most remarkably, she began to understand that the midnight sun was not just an astronomical phenomenon, but a doorway into a different kind of awareness. The constant daylight dissolved the normal boundaries between conscious and unconscious states, allowing minds to merge and share experiences in ways that were impossible under normal circumstances. When Dr. Chatterjee Moore woke from the shared dream, she found that her research data had been fundamentally transformed. The EEG readings showed that during the shared dreaming periods, her participants' brain activity had synchronized not just with each other, but with natural electromagnetic patterns in the Earth's magnetic field. The midnight sun was somehow facilitating a form of consciousness that connected human awareness directly to planetary rhythms. Over the final weeks of her study, Dr. Chatterjee Moore documented increasingly sophisticated forms of shared dreaming. Participants began to report prophetic dreams that accurately predicted weather patterns, wildlife movements, and other natural phenomena. They described receiving knowledge from deceased relatives and ancestors, information that later proved to be historically accurate when checked against tribal records. Most significantly, the participants began to demonstrate enhanced empathy and emotional connection in their waking lives. Conflicts that had existed in the community for years were resolved as people gained direct insight into each other's thoughts and feelings through their shared dream experiences. Children began showing advanced understanding of traditional ecological knowledge that typically took years to acquire through conventional learning. When the midnight sun period finally ended and normal day-night cycles returned, the shared dreaming experiences gradually faded. Dr. Chatterjee Moore's participants retained memories of their collective unconscious adventures, but they could no longer access that state of merged awareness. The EEG synchronization disappeared, and individual dream patterns returned to normal variations. Dr. Chatterjee Moore returned to Michigan with data that challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness, individual identity, and the relationship between human awareness and natural cycles. When she attempted to publish her findings in mainstream scientific journals, her work was rejected as unscientific and impossible to replicate under controlled laboratory conditions. But she continued her research, focusing on indigenous communities in extreme environments where normal boundaries of human experience were stretched to their limits. She discovered similar phenomena in other polar regions, high-altitude locations, and places where natural light cycles were dramatically different from temperate zone norms. The midnight sun had taught her that human consciousness was far more flexible and interconnected than Western science had assumed. In environments where normal barriers dissolved, minds could merge and share experiences in ways that pointed toward a more fundamental unity underlying individual awareness. Dr. Chatterjee Moore never forgot the feeling of perfect connection she had experienced in the shared dream space beneath the endless Arctic sun. It had shown her that the boundaries between self and other, between past and present, between human consciousness and natural rhythms were far more permeable than most people realized. The midnight sun continued to rise over Anaktuvuk Pass every summer, offering the same opportunity for expanded awareness to anyone willing to surrender their normal assumptions about the nature of consciousness and individual identity. Some doorways, she had learned, only opened when the familiar patterns of light and darkness were replaced by the eternal radiance of the Arctic summer. Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we venture into the most remote and unforgiving corners of the Appalachian Mountains, where civilization fades and something far more primitive takes hold. In this episode, we will uncover 8 deeply disturbing encounters with feral human beings who have abandoned society and embraced a savage existence in the ancient wilderness. These are not legends or folklore, but documented testimonies from geologists, park rangers, hunters, and researchers who stumbled upon communities of people living in ways that defy modern understanding. Each account has been meticulously verified through cross-referenced reports, physical evidence, and witness testimonies that paint a horrifying picture of human devolution in America's last wild places. To protect the privacy and safety of those involved, certain names and specific locations have been carefully altered, but the core experiences remain untouched in all their terrifying authenticity. These survivors have chosen to share their stories as warnings to others who might venture too deep into the mountains where humanity ends and something else begins. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Buried Files for daily true horror content that will leave you questioning what lurks in the shadows of our world. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the files that others tried to bury. Now let us begin our descent into the heart of Appalachian darkness. My name is Dakota Williams, and I have been a park ranger for the Great Smoky Mountains National Park for 11 years. In that time, I have seen my fair share of dangerous wildlife, lost hikers, and emergency rescues. But nothing in my training prepared me for what happened during the 3rd week of September 2022. What I am about to tell you goes against every official report I filed, every statement I gave to my supervisors, and every rational explanation I once believed about what lives in these ancient mountains. It started with the missing hikers. 3 separate incidents in 4 days, all along the same general area near Cataract Falls, about 7 miles into the backcountry. The first was Rebecca Martinez, a 26-year-old from Nashville who had been backpacking solo. Her tent was found intact, sleeping bag still rolled out, but her hiking boots were missing and her food cache had been completely emptied. Not by bears, though. Bears leave distinct claw marks and tear packaging apart. This was methodical, almost surgical in its precision. The second disappearance was more troubling. 2 college students from Georgia, Tyler and Amanda, had been camping together near the old logging road that cuts through Pine Creek Ridge. Their campsite looked like it had been abandoned in the middle of dinner. Canned beans still warm in the pot, flashlights still on, but both their packs were gone and their hiking poles had been snapped in half and arranged in a peculiar pattern around their extinguished fire. The pattern looked almost ritualistic, like some kind of warning or territorial marker. By the time we found the 3rd site, I knew we were dealing with something beyond standard search and rescue protocols. An experienced outdoorsman named Frank Costello had been hiking the same trail system for 20 years. He knew these mountains better than most of the seasonal rangers. His campsite was completely destroyed, not damaged, but systematically dismantled. Every piece of equipment had been taken apart, sorted, and arranged in neat piles based on material. Metal items in one stack, synthetic fabrics in another, food containers in a third. It was the work of intelligence, not animal instinct. My supervisor assigned me to lead a 3-day search operation with 2 other rangers, hoping to find some trace of the missing hikers before the weather turned. We packed enough supplies for 5 days just in case and set out before dawn on Thursday morning. The plan was to follow the main trail system, then branch out into the more remote areas where the disappearances had occurred. The first day yielded nothing unusual. We found the abandoned campsites I had already documented, took additional photographs, and searched the surrounding area for any signs of struggle or direction of travel. The forest felt different than usual, though, too quiet. In 11 years of working these trails, I had never hiked for hours without hearing the standard sounds of wildlife. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter, no rustling in the underbrush. Even the insects seemed muted. That evening, we made camp at a designated backcountry site about 4 miles from the last known location of Frank Costello. As we prepared dinner, Ranger Phillips mentioned something that had been bothering him all day. He had been finding tracks, but they did not match any known wildlife in the area. They were roughly human-sized, but the gait pattern was wrong. Too long between steps, and the impression showed toes that were unusually spread, like someone who had never worn shoes. Around midnight, we heard the first call. It started as what sounded like a woman crying for help, echoing from somewhere deep in the valley below our campsite. We immediately grabbed our gear and headed toward the sound, following standard rescue protocols. But as we got closer, the voice changed. It became deeper, more guttural, and the words became less distinct. By the time we reached the area where the sound had originated, there was only silence. That was when Phillips found the first trail marker. Not an official Park Service marker, but something else entirely. A deer skull mounted on a broken tree branch, positioned at eye level and facing directly back toward our campsite. The bone had been stripped completely clean, but there were tool marks on it. Deliberate scraping and cutting that suggested the use of crude but effective implements. We followed a series of these markers for over a mile, each one more elaborate than the last. Animal bones arranged in specific patterns, strips of fabric that clearly came from hiking gear, and eventually pieces of human clothing hung from branches like primitive flags. The trail led us deeper into terrain that was not marked on any of our maps, through dense undergrowth that showed clear signs of regular travel. The path ended at a clearing that should not have existed. In the center was what I can only describe as a processing site. Large, flat rocks arranged in a circle, stained dark with what was unmistakably blood. Animal hides stretched between wooden frames made from saplings. Piles of bones sorted by type and size. And hanging from a makeshift rack constructed of branches and rope, strips of meat in various stages of drying. But it was the smell that confirmed our worst fears. Not just the metallic scent of blood or the gamey odor of wild meat. There was something else underneath it all. Something sweet and wrong that made my stomach turn. I had smelled it once before, during a recovery operation where we found a hiker who had been dead for over a week. Human decomposition has a distinct odor that you never forget. As we stood there trying to process what we were seeing, Phillips grabbed my arm and pointed toward the tree line. 3 figures stood at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in our flashlight beams. They were human in shape, but wrong in every other way. Gaunt and pale, with long matted hair and movements that were too fluid, too predatory. They wore scraps of clothing that looked like it had been assembled from multiple sources, and they carried crude weapons made from sharpened sticks and metal scavenged from camping gear. The largest of the 3 stepped forward and made a sound that was part growl, part vocalization. It was clearly some form of communication, but unlike any language I had ever heard. The other 2 responded in kind, and they began to circle our position with the coordinated precision of pack hunters. We backed toward the trail we had followed into the clearing, but one of the creatures moved to block our path. Up close, I could see that it had once been human, but years of living wild had changed it in fundamental ways. Its teeth were filed to points, its fingernails grown long and sharp, and its skin was covered in scars and primitive tattoos made from ash and blood. The standoff lasted only seconds before training took over. We fired our service weapons into the air, hoping to scare them off without causing injury. The sound echoed through the forest, and the creatures immediately scattered, disappearing into the underbrush with inhuman speed and silence. We ran. For over 2 miles, we ran through terrain that seemed designed to slow us down and separate us. Fallen logs blocked our path at regular intervals, forcing us to climb over or go around. Low-hanging branches created natural barriers that had to be navigated carefully in the dark. And all around us, we could hear them moving through the forest, staying parallel to our position but never quite visible. By the time we reached our original campsite, dawn was beginning to break through the canopy. We packed our gear in record time and hiked directly back to the ranger station, where I immediately contacted my supervisor and the county sheriff. The official report documented our discovery of what we termed an illegal hunting camp and possible poaching operation. No mention was made of the creatures we encountered or the clear evidence of human predation we had witnessed. 2 weeks later, a joint operation between Park Service personnel and federal agents returned to the site. They found nothing. The clearing had been abandoned, all evidence removed, and the trail markers had been taken down. According to the official summary, we had likely encountered a group of individuals living illegally within park boundaries who had fled when discovered. But I know what I saw. And 6 months later, when the disappearances started again, this time near Cades Cove, I was not surprised. I requested a transfer to a different park and was granted approval within 30 days. My replacement, a young ranger named Matthews, lasted exactly 3 weeks before requesting his own transfer. He never told me what he encountered, but I recognized the look in his eyes, the same haunted expression I see in my own reflection every morning. The official position of the National Park Service is that no feral human populations exist within protected boundaries. But late at night, when I am alone with my thoughts, I remember the intelligence behind those pale eyes and the calculated way they moved through their territory. Whatever they once were, they had adapted to life in the deep wilderness in ways that made them more dangerous than any natural predator. I still work as a park ranger, but now in Colorado, where the mountains are younger and the forests hold different secrets. Sometimes, though, I get calls from colleagues still working in the Smokies. They tell me about hikers who vanish without explanation, about campsites found empty with all the food missing, about sounds in the night that do not match any known wildlife. And I tell them what my supervisor told me after I filed my original report. Some things are better left unreported, and some trails are better left unfollowed. The Smoky Mountains have been home to humans for thousands of years, but not all of them chose to remain part of civilization. My name is Marcus Thompson, and if you are listening to this, let me say one thing up front. I am not a storyteller. I am a geologist. That means I spend my days squinting at rocky outcrops, taking core samples and running numbers on mineral content, not spinning ghost stories around the campfire. But every so often, the world reminds you that numbers cannot explain everything. Some things belong to the wilderness, and the Appalachians, ancient, lonely, and largely untamed, hide things no field manual will tell you about. It was a late October morning in 2023 when I hiked up into the Blue Ridge on assignment. My company had been contracted to survey an area for a possible pipeline expansion, and my section included a stretch of remote, rocky terrain near the Carolina border. The locals in the neighboring town of Elmswood said little about the area except that it was best left undisturbed. Some joked about mountain lions, others about something older. I tuned it all out. I had data to collect. The first thing you have to understand about this place is the silence. I do not mean the quiet of a city park or even the hush after fresh snowfall. I mean the kind of quiet that presses against your ears, making you aware of your own breathing. The wind in these mountains moves in odd currents. Sometimes a gentle sigh, sometimes a cold hand up the back of your neck. The trees here grow thick and close, their roots so tangled in the old rock that when you try to cut a trail, you end up walking in circles. That morning, the autumn leaves had already fallen in great rust red and gold mats, muffling even my own footsteps. The initial part of my hike was routine. I checked coordinates, marked outcrops, and documented a few minor landslides. About 3 miles from the main road, past an abandoned fire tower, the ground pitched downward without warning. The soil here breaks into shelves, scarred by centuries of frost and flood. My boots crunched over broken stones peppered with white bleached animal bones, deer, rabbit, raccoon, and things I could not immediately name. Then I found the entrance. It was almost by accident. The map in my hand showed a cluster of limestone shortcuts, but it did not mark this. A slit in the hill about 5 feet high and 3 feet across, half concealed by blackberry thicket and loose scree. At first I thought it was just a failed fox den, but something about the geometry, deliberate, almost architectural, caught my attention. I set down my pack, flicked on my headlamp, and squeezed inside. Inside, the cave air was heavy, the temperature instantly dropping several degrees. The beam of my flashlight swept over rock walls mottled with veins of white and rusty orange calcite. About 20 feet in, the passage widened unexpectedly. A natural chamber maybe 15 feet across, domed overhead. Something scuttled in the darkness. I froze, breath clouding in the sudden chill. That was when I noticed 2 things at once. First, the scent. It was not an animal smell per se. It was wet earth, sweat, something raw and unnatural like rust and wild onions. Second, the marks. At first I thought they were petroglyphs, marks left by ancient hands, their precise meaning lost to time. But the patterns were crude, yet fresh. Long parallel scratches, shallow at either end, scored deeply into the limestone at odd intervals. There were also smudges, ashy, greasy fingerprints, and 4 old, blood-darkened handprints spidered across the wall above a nest of moss and animal pelts. I felt real unease for the first time. Years of fieldwork have taught me what is and is not a bear, a wildcat, or a trespassing scavenger. But nothing I knew lined up with what I saw here. The nest, if you could call it that, was ringed not only with tufts of dry grass and leaves, but with carefully arranged bones, most of them animal, but some plainly horrifyingly human. Fingers, a jawbone, what looked like several molars embedded in a chunk of weathered gum. My rational mind insisted I was witnessing the detritus of some deranged squatter. Maybe a small-time cult or someone hiding from the world and sinking into madness. But then I heard the breathing. It came from deeper in the cave, a slow, laboring draw of air, so faint I almost missed it. My muscles locked, time stretched out. Then deliberately I stepped back, headlamp swinging, heart kicking a painful rhythm in my chest. That was when the thing moved. The barest shuffle, then a soft grunt, not animal, not quite human. My beam caught on an eye, not the red shine of a deer nor the pale flicker of a raccoon. This was a wet, milky orb, blinkless, socketed in a gaunt, angular face streaked with dirt and tangled black hair. Its lips thinned over oversized teeth, fragments of something soft and pink hanging from its mouth. I stifled a gasp. My mind, despite everything, tried to negotiate. This was a person, after all. a desperate, starved hermit. I forced myself to speak. "Who's there? Do you need help?" My words barely echoed, dissolving in the humid dark. The being clicked its tongue rapidly, a staccato rhythm echoing against stone, its nostrils widening as if to scent me. It ducked low, frog-like, impossibly fast, hands touching the dirt as if ready to launch forward. I retreated several steps, pulse hammering in my ears. I remembered what my local contact, Joe, 60-something, lived his whole life in Elmswood, told me before I left. If you hear whistling or see shapes watching you from the tree line, do not linger, do not stare, do not try to help. I flicked my headlamp off for an instant, willing my body to quiet. When I turned it back on, the thing had crept closer, almost at the edge of the light. I could make out a twisted, splayed body, long limbs, muddy fingers, ribs showing through smudged skin. No clothes except a ragged sheet or pelt knotted at the waist. It crawled like a spider. Suddenly it screamed. The sound was nothing like a human. It started deep in the chest, then rose, ululating, hitting an octave that sent birds fleeing from trees outside. My ears rang. Instinct took over and I ran. I stumbled, lost my balance, bashed my shoulder bloody against a stone outcropping, but somehow clawed my way into the open air. Adrenaline made everything vivid, the shock of sunlight, the hiss of wind in brittle grass, the taste of bile in my throat. As I staggered back onto the trail, I heard something shuffle behind me, then impossibly a faint, mocking whistle. The same pattern I had tapped on rock as a child when I was scared of the dark. The thing was mimicking me. I ran until my legs gave out. Every bush and shadow seemed to breathe, and I found myself constantly glancing back, half convinced I was being followed. I reached half a mile down the trail before collapsing in the dry leaves. Only then, shaking, did I check my phone. No bars, no GPS signal. I forced myself to keep moving, panic rising afresh with every imagined footfall, every twig snap. Eventually, numb with fatigue, I reached my car as late afternoon light poured sideways across the mountain. I fumbled my keys, hands shaking, and started the engine. Through the rearview mirror, I caught a flicker at the edge of the woods, the shadow of something long-limbed just out of sight. I never went back. The next day, the company called. The survey was canceled, nothing further needed at my site. I told them someone was living in that cave, that it was not safe. The words felt weak, like something I should have forgotten after a sleepless night, but they have not left me. Weeks passed and I tried to forget, to rationalize. But every now and then I would get a text or call from colleagues assigned further down the escarpment. Small things at first. Missing equipment, butchered kits, GPS units ruined or stolen, weird scratches found on vehicles. Months later, Joe called me, voice hollow. "Listen, Marcus," he whispered. "They found another cave. This time there were boot prints, not just animal ones, but both. Big, human. But the rangers said they ended halfway up a cliff wall, like whoever made them walked into thin air." "What about the person?" He paused so long I thought the line had dropped. "Wasn't just one," he finally said. "There's more than one thing living up there. And the oldest folks say some of them have been there longer than the towns. Longer than people I hung up, cold and sweating." I moved back north a few months later and changed my cell number. But sometimes, especially on autumn nights just before dark, when the wind howls through narrow valleys, I smell that mix of wet earth, sweat, and old wild onions. And I remember the watcher in the cave, waiting for darkness to fall again. If there is a lesson, it is this. Do not go inviting explanations for the unnatural. Sometimes the things that stare from the dark are not waiting to be found, and if you do find them, they will remember your face. My name is Isabella Rodriguez, and I spent 3 summers working as an outdoor education counselor for Camp Wildwood, a residential program that brought inner-city kids from Baltimore and Philadelphia into the West Virginia mountains for 2 weeks of wilderness experience. I loved that job. There is something magical about watching a teenager who has never seen stars without light pollution look up at the Milky Way for the first time, or helping a kid who grew up in concrete and asphalt learn to identify bird calls and animal tracks. The summer of 2021 was my 3rd year with the program, and I had been promoted to senior counselor, which meant I was responsible for the overnight backpacking trips with our older campers. These were 14 and 15-year-olds who had demonstrated responsibility and wilderness skills during their first week at base camp. The backpacking experience was meant to be the highlight of their stay, 3 days and 2 nights in the deep forest of Monongahela, sleeping under canvas and learning advanced survival techniques. Our group that July consisted of 8 kids and 3 counselors, including myself. The other 2 counselors were Marcus, a 24-year-old forestry student from West Virginia University, and Sarah, a 23-year-old from Pittsburgh who had been working wilderness programs for 4 years. We had been planning this particular route for months, a challenging but manageable loop trail that would take us through some of the most beautiful and remote parts of the forest. The first day went perfectly. We hiked 6 miles through mixed hardwood forest, crossed 3 streams, and made camp in a designated backcountry site near Otter Creek. The kids were excited and engaged, asking good questions about plant identification and animal behavior. After dinner, we sat around our carefully contained campfire, and I taught them some of the Cherokee legends about the mountains while Sarah helped them identify constellations. It was around 10:30 that night when we first heard the other children laughing. At first, none of us thought much of it. Summer camps use the Monongahela system regularly, and while our site was supposed to be isolated, it was possible another group was camping within a mile or 2 of our location. The laughter was distant but clear, the unmistakable sound of kids playing some kind of game in the dark. High-pitched giggles and what sounded like a group of voices calling out to each other. One of our campers, a 14-year-old named Damon from West Philadelphia, sat up in his sleeping bag and listened intently. "Miss Isabella," he whispered, "that sounds like kids our age. Can we go say hi?" I explained that wandering around in the forest at night was against safety protocols, but promised we would keep an ear out and maybe try to make contact in the morning if the other group was still in the area. The voices continued for about 20 minutes, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always just at the edge of our hearing. What struck me as odd was the consistency of the laughter. In my experience working with teenagers, group play usually involves periods of quiet planning, arguments about rules, or natural breaks in activity. But these voices maintained the same level of excited chatter without any variation in tone or intensity. Around midnight, the sound stopped completely and we all settled in for sleep. I was sharing a tent with 2 of the girls, and Marcus and Sarah each had tents with groups of the boys. As the senior counselor, I always stayed awake longer than the others, making sure everyone was settled and listening for any sounds that might indicate wildlife in the area. I must have dozed off around 1 in the morning because the next thing I remember was being woken by Sarah shaking my shoulder. "Isabella," she whispered urgently, "you need to hear this." I checked my watch. It was 3:15. Outside our tent, I could hear voices again, but they were much closer this time. Close enough that I could make out individual words. What I heard made my blood run cold. The voices were calling out names, but they were the names of our campers. "Damon," called a young voice that sounded exactly like one of our girls. "Damon, come play with us." Then another voice, this one sounding like Marcus. "Isabella, we found something cool. Come see." But Marcus was in his tent and I could hear him breathing deeply in sleep. And the girl whose voice had called for Damon was in the tent right next to mine, also clearly asleep. Sarah grabbed my arm. "They have been doing this for 10 minutes, she whispered, using our voices, calling our names. But everyone is accounted for. I unzipped the tent flap slightly and peered out into the darkness. Our campfire had died down to glowing embers, but there was enough moonlight to see the immediate area around our tents. Nothing moved, but the voices continued, now coming from multiple directions around our campsite. A perfect imitation of my own voice called out, "Marcus, can you help me with something?" Then what sounded exactly like Sarah. "Kids, wake up. We are going to see something amazing." The mimicry was flawless. Not just the tone and pitch, but speech patterns and phrases that each of us actually used. Whoever or whatever was out there had been listening to us carefully enough to reproduce our individual ways of speaking with perfect accuracy. I made a decision that probably saved our lives. Instead of investigating or trying to make contact, I woke everyone up as quietly as possible and told them we were breaking camp immediately. Some of the kids complained, thinking it was some kind of drill or test, but the fear in my voice must have convinced them this was serious. We packed our gear by flashlight in complete silence, and within 30 minutes we were hiking back toward base camp in the middle of the night. The voices followed us for the first mile, sometimes ahead of us on the trail, sometimes flanking us through the trees, always using our own voices to try to get us to respond or separate from the group. "Isabella, why are we running?" in perfect imitation of one of my campers. "Guys, wait up. I dropped something," in Sarah's exact voice, even though Sarah was right beside me. The most terrifying moment came when we reached a fork in the trail. We had taken the left path on our way in, but in the darkness and stress of the emergency evacuation, I was not entirely certain which way led back to camp. As I stood there with my map and compass trying to get our bearings, I heard my own voice calling from the right-hand path. "This way, everyone." I found the trail, but I was standing right there and I had not said a word. That was when 8-year-old Keisha, one of our younger campers who had been moved up to the advanced group because of her exceptional wilderness skills, tugged on my sleeve and whispered something that still gives me nightmares. "Miss Isabella," she said, "I can see them in the trees. They look like kids, but they are moving wrong." I followed her gaze and saw shapes moving through the forest canopy, traveling from branch to branch with fluid grace that no human child could possess. They were roughly the right size and shape to be teenagers, but they moved like primates, swinging and leaping between trees with casual ease. And they were naked, their pale skin almost luminous in the moonlight. We took the left path and kept moving, but the pursuit continued for another 2 miles. The voices became more desperate and commanding, perfect imitations of our own voices ordering us to stop, to come back, to split up so they could help us better. They knew our names, our mannerisms, even private conversations we had had earlier in the day. Around 5 in the morning, as dawn began to filter through the forest canopy, the voices finally stopped. We reached base camp exhausted and shaken, but alive and all accounted for. The camp director, a man named Robert who had been running wilderness programs for 15 years, listened to our report with growing concern. After we had all eaten breakfast and the kids were resting in their cabins, he pulled the 3 counselors aside for a private conversation. "This is not the first time something like this has happened," he told us. "We have had reports of voices in the forest, mimicry, and sightings of what people describe as feral children for the past 3 years. Always in the same general area where you were camping." He showed us a file that contained incident reports from other camps and individual hikers, all describing similar encounters with beings that appeared to be human children but displayed impossible physical abilities and predatory behavior. According to Robert, the local rangers were aware of the situation but had no effective way to address it. The creatures, whatever they were, showed clear intelligence and seemed to understand that they were being hunted. They avoided all attempts at contact or capture, and they never left physical evidence that could be documented or studied. The most disturbing part of Robert's briefing was his theory about what we were dealing with. He believed these were children who had become lost in the forest over the years and had somehow survived by adapting to a completely wild existence. Cut off from human society during critical developmental years, they had reverted to primitive behaviors while retaining enough human intelligence to be incredibly dangerous. The mimicry suggests they understand that human communication is important, he explained. But they use it as a hunting tool, the way some predators use camouflage or deception to catch prey. They have learned that humans respond to familiar voices, especially the voices of people they trust. We never went back to that area of the forest. The camp program was moved to a different section of Monongahela the following summer, and new safety protocols were established requiring all overnight trips to carry satellite communication devices and travel in larger groups. But I sometimes wonder about those children, if that is what they were. How long had they been living wild in those mountains? How many were there? And what had happened to turn them from lost children into something that hunted other humans? 6 months after our encounter, Robert called to tell me that 2 hikers had gone missing in the same area where we had been camping. Their backpacks were found hanging from tree branches 30 feet off the ground, but there was no sign of the hikers themselves. The local search and rescue team found tracks around the area, small human footprints that led into the forest canopy and disappeared. I still work with kids, but now in urban educational programs where the biggest danger is traffic and the most exotic wildlife is pigeons. Sometimes, though, when I hear children laughing and playing outside my apartment window, I find myself listening carefully to make sure the voices belong to children I can actually see. Because I learned that summer that not everything that sounds human actually is, and some of the most dangerous predators are the ones that know exactly how to sound like someone you trust. The Monongahela National Forest covers over 900,000 acres of wilderness. That is a lot of space for things to hide, and a lot of places where lost children might learn to survive in ways that change them into something else entirely. Something that remembers just enough about being human to be more dangerous than any natural predator. My name is Jackson O'Brien, and I have been bow hunting in the Pennsylvania mountains for 15 years. I grew up in Scranton, but every November since I turned 16, I have made the trip up to the Allegheny National Forest with my father and uncle for our annual deer hunt. It was a tradition that meant everything to me. 3 generations of O'Brien men carrying on something that had started with my great-grandfather, who immigrated from County Cork in 1923. The autumn of 2020 was different because it was the first year I went without my father. He had passed away from cancer that spring, and my Uncle Pat decided he was too old to make the trip anymore. But I could not break the tradition. I convinced my 2 best friends, Derek and Tommy, to join me for what I promised would be a straightforward hunting trip in an area I knew better than my own neighborhood. We arrived at our usual campsite on Sunday afternoon, the 2nd week of November. The location was perfect for deer hunting, a small clearing surrounded by oak and maple trees about 8 miles into the forest, accessible only by an old logging road that required 4-wheel drive to navigate. We had been camping there for years, and I could set up our base camp with my eyes closed. Derek was 29, a construction foreman from Philadelphia who had grown up hunting with his grandfather. Tommy was 31 like me, an Iraq veteran who worked as a mechanic and used hunting as a way to deal with what he called his demons from overseas. Both were experienced outdoorsmen who knew how to move quietly through the forest and respect the wilderness we were entering. The first sign that something was different came Monday morning. We split up before dawn to cover more ground, each taking a different section of the ridge system we had mapped out over years of hunting the area. The plan was to meet back at camp by noon to compare notes and plan the afternoon hunt. I was about 2 miles north of our campsite, sitting in a tree stand I had used many times before, when I noticed the complete absence of wildlife. In 15 years of hunting these mountains, I had never experienced such absolute silence. No bird calls, no squirrels moving through the trees, not even the sound of insects. It was like every living thing had decided to leave the area overnight. Around 10 in the morning, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Something large was moving through the forest about 100 yards to my east, staying just at the edge of my sight. At first, I assumed it was Derek or Tommy, maybe tracking a wounded deer or exploring new territory. But the movement pattern was wrong. Too fluid, too quiet, and following no logical hunting strategy I could recognize. I climbed down from my stand and tried to get a better look, but whatever it was stayed just out of clear view. I could catch glimpses through the trees, a dark shape that seemed to be paralleling my position but maintaining its distance. When I moved toward it, it moved away. When I stopped, it stopped. It was like being shadowed by something that understood exactly what I was doing and why. By noon, neither Derek nor Tommy had returned to camp. I waited until 2 in the afternoon, then began following the trails we had agreed they would take. Derek's path led along a creek bed where the hunting was usually excellent, but I found no trace of him beyond his initial tracks leaving camp. Tommy's route took him up to a rocky outcropping that provided a good view of the entire valley, but when I reached the spot, there was no sign he had ever been there. I spent the rest of the afternoon calling their names and firing signal shots with my rifle, standard protocol when someone gets lost or separated. The sound echoed through the mountains, but there was no response. As darkness fell, I returned to camp and built up the fire, hoping they would see the light and find their way back. That was when I heard the first response to my calls. It came from the direction Derek had taken that morning. A perfect imitation of Tommy's voice calling my name. "Jackson," it called, "stay over here." I found something, but Tommy had gone in the opposite direction and the voice was coming from an area I had already searched thoroughly. I grabbed my rifle and a flashlight and headed toward the sound, but as I got closer, the voice moved farther away. It kept calling, sometimes using Derek's voice, sometimes Tommy's, always staying just out of sight and leading me deeper into unfamiliar territory. After 20 minutes of following the voices through dense underbrush, I realized what was happening and stopped dead in my tracks. Something was using my friends' voices to lure me away from camp, and that meant either they were being controlled somehow or something else had learned to mimic their speech perfectly. Either possibility terrified me. I made it back to camp and spent the night awake by the fire, rifle across my knees, listening to the voices of my friends calling to me from multiple directions around the perimeter of the clearing. Sometimes they sounded injured, begging for help. Sometimes they sounded excited, claiming to have made a big kill and needing assistance. The mimicry was flawless, including inside jokes and personal references that only Derek and Tommy would know. Tuesday morning, I made the decision that probably saved my life. Instead of continuing to search for my friends, I broke camp and hiked directly back to where we had parked the truck. The entire 8-mile hike, I was followed by voices in the forest, becoming increasingly desperate and angry as they realized I was leaving. When I reached the truck, I found Derek's bow and arrow quiver hanging from the side mirror. They had not been there when we arrived Sunday, and they showed clear signs of being deliberately placed as some kind of message or trophy. The arrows had been removed, and the bowstring had been cut, making the weapon useless. I drove directly to the Pennsylvania State Police barracks and reported my friends missing. The search and rescue operation began that afternoon and continued for 5 days. They found Tommy's backpack hanging from a tree branch 20 feet off the ground, but there was no indication of how it had gotten there or why someone would have placed it at that height. Derek's rifle was discovered 3 days later, partially buried under a pile of stones arranged in a careful pattern. The weapon had been completely disassembled, every piece separated and cleaned, then reassembled incorrectly so that it could not function. It was the work of intelligence, not animals or natural processes. The official search was called off after a week with no trace of either man beyond the abandoned equipment. The conclusion was that they had become lost or injured and succumbed to exposure, though their bodies were never recovered despite extensive efforts involving helicopters and teams of volunteers. But I knew what had really happened, and 6 months later I got confirmation. I was contacted by a park ranger named Williams, who worked in a different section of the Allegheny National Forest. She told me that hunting parties had been reporting similar experiences for the past 2 years. Voices calling from the forest using the names and speech patterns of missing members. Equipment found arranged in deliberate patterns that suggested intelligence and planning. According to Ranger Williams, there was an unofficial theory among some of the Park Service personnel that a group of people had been living deep in the forest for years, possibly generations. They had developed hunting skills that surpassed anything modern outdoorsmen possessed, and they viewed the forest as their exclusive territory. The theory suggested that these people had learned to mimic human speech as a hunting technique, the same way some predatory animals use camouflage or deception. They would isolate individual members of hunting parties, then use their voices to lure others into situations where they could be captured or killed. She also told me that the Pennsylvania Game Commission had documented a significant decline in deer populations throughout the region over the past 5 years despite reduced hunting pressure and ideal breeding conditions. Something was hunting the deer with efficiency that exceeded both natural predation and legal hunting combined. I never went back to the Allegheny Mountains. The following year I started hunting in New York State, always in groups of at least 4 people, and never in areas more than 3 miles from a main road. But sometimes when I am sitting in a tree stand waiting for deer, I hear voices calling from deeper in the forest. And sometimes those voices sound exactly like Derek and Tommy, still trying to get me to follow them into the darkness. Tommy's wife received his military death benefits after the official declaration, but Derek's family never got closure. His parents still believe he might be alive somewhere, maybe injured and unable to find his way home. I have never told them about the voices that used his speech patterns or about the bow hanging from our truck like a warning sign. The Allegheny Mountains have been home to hunters for thousands of years, long before Europeans arrived with modern weapons and hunting regulations. Some of those hunters never stopped viewing the forest as their territory, and they have developed skills that make modern outdoorsmen look like amateurs playing games in their backyard. They are still there, watching and waiting for the next group that ventures too deep into their domain. And they have learned that the most effective way to hunt humans is to use the voices of people we trust, calling to us from the darkness until we follow them far enough from safety that no one will ever find us again. My name is Ezra Mitchell, and for 7 years I lived completely off the grid in the remote foothills of eastern Kentucky. I moved there in 2015 after a messy divorce cost me my house in Louisville and left me questioning everything about modern life. I bought 43 acres of mountainous woodland for less than what most people pay for a car, built a small cabin with my own hands, and learned to live the way my great-grandfather had lived before electricity, and running water changed everything. The property was beautiful in its isolation. Dense mixed forest of oak, maple, and pine stretched in every direction, broken only by a clear creek that ran through the lower section and provided fresh water year-round. The nearest neighbor was over 3 miles away through difficult terrain, and the closest road that could handle a regular vehicle was a 2-mile hike down a steep trail I had cut myself. It was exactly the kind of solitude I had been seeking, a place where a man could live according to his own rules and never have to deal with the complications of modern society. I had been there about 18 months when I first noticed signs that someone else was using my property. It started small. Footprints in the soft mud near the creek that were not made by my boots. Stones that had been moved from their natural positions to create what looked like primitive markers or trail signs. Areas where someone had clearly been digging, though for what purpose I could not determine. At first I assumed it was someone passing through, maybe hunting illegally or using my land as a shortcut to somewhere else. These mountains had been home to people for centuries before property lines and deeds divided everything up, and I figured I was probably not the first person to think this particular piece of wilderness would make a good place to live. But the signs became more frequent and more deliberate. Someone was harvesting wild edibles from areas I had been managing myself, taking specific plants in a pattern that showed knowledge of sustainable gathering practices. My fish traps in the creek were being checked and sometimes emptied, but whoever was doing it knew enough to reset them properly afterward. Most disturbing of all, I started finding evidence that someone had been watching my cabin from various positions in the surrounding forest. One morning in late September, I discovered fresh footprints in the soft earth near my garden that led directly to my root cellar. I had built the cellar into the hillside behind my cabin using traditional methods I had learned from books about Appalachian homesteading. It was basically a cave lined with stone walls and wooden shelving designed to keep vegetables and preserved food at a constant cool temperature through the winter months. The footprints were human but wrong somehow. Too narrow for their length, with the toes spread wider than normal like someone who had never worn shoes. They circled the cellar entrance multiple times, and whoever had made them had spent considerable time examining the wooden door I had built to seal the entrance. That evening, I decided to keep watch. I positioned myself in the loft of my cabin with a clear view of the root cellar and settled in for what I figured might be a long night. I had my hunting rifle and a thermos of coffee prepared to wait until dawn if necessary. Around 2 in the morning, I saw movement near the tree line. A figure emerged from the forest and approached the root cellar with the careful movements of someone who knew exactly where they were going. In the moonlight, I could see it was human-shaped but moved wrong, staying low to the ground and using both hands and feet to navigate the terrain. The figure spent nearly an hour examining my root cellar, running its hands over the door and walls, even pressing its face against the wood as if trying to smell what was inside. Finally, it began to dig. Not at the door, but next to the cellar, scraping at the earth with its bare hands and what looked like crude tools made from sharpened sticks and stones. I watched in growing alarm as it became clear that whoever this was intended to dig their way into my food storage. This was not casual trespassing or harmless curiosity. This was someone who knew I had food stored there and was methodically planning to take it. I made a decision that I have regretted ever since. Instead of confronting the intruder immediately, I decided to wait and see how far they would go. I told myself I was being cautious, but the truth is I was afraid. Something about the figure's movements and the deliberate way it worked suggested this was not some random vagrant or desperate local resident. This was something else entirely. The digging continued for 3 nights. Each time the figure would emerge from the forest around the same time, work for several hours, then disappear before dawn. It was making steady progress, tunneling along the stone wall of the cellar toward what I knew was the corner where I kept my winter supply of potatoes and preserved meat. On the 4th night, I decided to move my observation post closer. I climbed down from the cabin loft and positioned myself behind a large oak tree about 50 feet from the cellar. From there, I had a much clearer view of what was happening, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The figure was not alone. There were 3 of them, all working together with the coordinated efficiency of people who had done this kind of thing before. They had tools, crude but effective implements made from metal scavenged from old farm equipment and sharpened stones, and they were not just digging randomly. They had a plan, a systematic approach to reaching my stored food that showed intelligence and long-term thinking. But it was their appearance that truly frightened me. These were human beings, but they had been changed by years of living completely wild. Their skin was darkened by dirt and weather, their hair grown long and matted with debris. They wore scraps of clothing that looked like it had been assembled from multiple sources. Animal hides mixed with fragments of modern fabric that had probably been scavenged from abandoned campsites or hunting cabins. Most disturbing of all was the way they communicated. They made soft grunting and clicking sounds, a primitive language that seemed to convey complex information with remarkable efficiency. They were organized, disciplined, and clearly accustomed to working as a team. By the 5th night, they had broken through into my root cellar. I watched from my hiding place as they systematically emptied my winter food supply, passing containers and bundles of preserved meat from hand to hand in a human chain that disappeared into the forest. They took everything. Months of preparation for winter gone in a single night. But they left something behind. In the morning, when I finally worked up the courage to inspect the damage, I found that they had arranged some of their own food stores in place of what they had taken. Wild tubers, nuts, dried meat that smelled wrong, and other foraged items I could not identify. It was not an equal trade by any means, but it was clearly intentional. They were not thieves in the traditional sense. They were operating according to some kind of primitive social code that I did not understand. That was when I found the bones. Hidden in the back corner of the root cellar, carefully wrapped in what looked like human hair woven into crude rope, was a collection of bones that made me physically sick. Most were animal, but some were unmistakably human. Finger bones, teeth, what looked like pieces of a human skull. And they were old, weathered smooth by years of handling. I left that same day. I packed only what I could carry in my truck and abandoned 7 years of work building a life in those mountains. I never went back, never tried to sell the property, never even contacted the local authorities. I told myself that no one would believe me, but the truth is I was terrified of what might happen if I brought outside attention to whatever was living in those hills. 6 months later, I heard from a friend in Louisville who had seen a news report about the area. A hunting party had found what authorities described as an illegal campsite on the same mountain where my property was located. The report mentioned evidence of long-term habitation, primitive shelters, and what investigators called disturbing artifacts that suggested the site had been occupied for years. The hunters who made the discovery refused to go into detail about what they had seen, but one of them was quoted as saying that whoever had been living there was not living by any rules that civilized people would recognize. The investigation was turned over to federal authorities, and as far as I know, no results were ever made public. I live in a suburban apartment now, surrounded by neighbors and streetlights and all the complications of modern life I once tried to escape. But sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet, I remember the sound of those primitive voices communicating in the darkness, and the careful way they had arranged their offerings in place of the food they took. I think about the bones wrapped in human hair, and I wonder how many other people had tried to build lives in those remote mountains over the years. How many had encountered the same beings I met, and how many had made different choices about how to handle the situation. The Appalachian Mountains have been home to human beings for thousands of years, long before European settlers arrived and long before property deeds and modern law divided everything up into neat parcels. Some of those people never joined the modern world. never learned to live according to civilized rules, never stopped viewing the mountains as their territory and everyone else as intruders. They are still there, living according to ancient codes and defending their territory in ways that most people would never understand. And they are patient, watching and waiting for the next person who thinks they can build a life in the deep wilderness without understanding what else calls those mountains home. My name is Autumn Hayes, and I work as a meteorologist for the National Weather Service office in Little Rock, Arkansas. My specialty is severe weather prediction and storm tracking, which means I spend a lot of time in remote locations setting up monitoring equipment and collecting atmospheric data. Most of my field work is routine, but the assignment that took me into the Ozark Mountains in March of 2022 became something that no amount of scientific training could have prepared me for. I was part of a two-person team investigating an unusual weather pattern that had been developing over the Arkansas-Missouri border region. Satellite imagery showed atmospheric disturbances that did not match any known meteorological phenomena, and ground-based radar was picking up anomalies that suggested significant storm activity in areas where local weather stations were reporting clear skies. My partner was Dr. James Crawford, an atmospheric physicist from the University of Arkansas who specialized in rare weather events. We drove up into the mountains on a Tuesday morning in late March, when the forest was just beginning to show the first signs of spring. The assignment was supposed to take 3 days, setting up temporary monitoring stations and collecting baseline data to help explain the satellite anomalies. The first 2 days went smoothly. We established monitoring stations at 3 different elevations, collected soil temperature readings, and documented local topographical features that might be affecting air currents. The equipment was functioning perfectly, and we were getting consistent readings that should have helped explain the unusual satellite data. But on Thursday morning, everything changed. We woke up to weather conditions that should have been impossible given the forecast. The sky was a sickly yellow-green color that I had only seen once before, during a tornado outbreak in Oklahoma. The barometric pressure was dropping faster than anything our instruments could properly measure, and the temperature had fallen 30 degrees since midnight. Dr. Crawford checked our equipment 3 times, convinced there was a malfunction. According to every predictive model we had access to, the conditions we were experiencing could not exist in this geographic region during this time of year. The atmospheric pressure readings suggested we were in the path of a Category 3 hurricane, but we were 600 miles from the nearest ocean and 1,500 feet above sea level. Around noon, the storm hit with a ferocity that defied explanation. Winds that our anemometer measured at over 90 miles per hour before the device was destroyed by flying debris. Rain that fell so hard it was difficult to breathe if you faced into it. Lightning strikes that seemed to target metallic objects with deliberate precision, destroying 2 of our monitoring stations in the first hour. We took shelter in our research van, but it quickly became clear that the vehicle would not provide adequate protection. The storm was not moving in any predictable pattern. Instead of passing through the area like a normal weather system, it seemed to be circling our position, creating a localized vortex of destructive weather that had no basis in atmospheric science. By 3 in the afternoon, a pine tree the size of a telephone pole crashed across the road behind us, blocking our escape route. Dr. Crawford made the decision that probably saved our lives. He had noticed a cave opening about half a mile up the mountainside and suggested we abandon the van and seek shelter there until the storm passed. We grabbed our emergency supplies and fought our way through horizontal rain and debris to reach the cave entrance. It was larger than it had appeared from a distance, easily big enough for several people, and extended back into the mountain far enough that we could escape the noise and fury of the storm outside. But we were not alone in that cave. As we moved deeper into the darkness, our flashlights revealed clear signs of recent habitation. A fire pit with warm ashes, sleeping areas made from animal hides and moss, and crude tools fashioned from stone and scavenged metal. Most disturbing of all was the smell, a mixture of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and something else that made my stomach turn. Dr. Crawford wanted to leave immediately and find shelter elsewhere, but the storm outside had intensified to the point where venturing back into it would have been suicidal. We positioned ourselves near the cave entrance, close enough to escape quickly if necessary, but far enough inside to be protected from the weather. That was when we heard the voices. At first, they seemed to be coming from deeper in the cave system, soft murmuring that could have been wind moving through underground passages. But gradually, the sounds became more distinct, and we realized we were listening to human conversation in a language neither of us recognized. The voices grew louder and closer, and eventually we could see flickering light from deeper in the cave that suggested someone was approaching with torches or fire. Dr. Crawford and I pressed ourselves against the cave wall, hoping to remain hidden until whoever it was had passed by. What emerged from the depths of that cave still appears in my nightmares. 3 figures that had once been human but had been changed by years of living in complete isolation from civilization. They moved with the fluid grace of people who had adapted to navigating underground passages in total darkness, and their eyes reflected our flashlight beams like those of nocturnal animals. They wore clothing made from animal skins and plant fibers, primitive but expertly crafted. Their skin was pale from lack of sunlight, but tough and scarred from years of harsh living. Most unsettling of all was their reaction to our presence. They showed no surprise at finding strangers in their cave, as if they had been expecting us. The largest of the 3, a man who might have been 50 or 70 years old, stepped forward and spoke to us in perfect English. "Storm brought you here," he said, his voice raspy but clear. "Storm always brings the lost ones to us." He gestured toward the cave entrance where rain was still pounding the mountainside. "Been waiting 3 days for this one to build, right?" Dr. Crawford tried to explain that we were scientists conducting weather research, that we had equipment and colleagues who would be looking for us. The man listened patiently, then smiled with teeth that had been filed to sharp points. "No equipment works when the mountain calls the storm," he said. "Been calling storms for longer than your people been keeping weather records." That was when I understood that the atmospheric anomalies we had been sent to investigate were not natural phenomena. These people, whoever they were, had somehow learned to manipulate local weather patterns. The impossible storm conditions, the localized vortex, the equipment malfunctions, all of it was being controlled by human intelligence that had developed capabilities beyond anything modern science recognized. The 3 figures seemed to be debating something among themselves in their strange language, occasionally glancing at us and gesturing toward different parts of the cave. Finally, the leader turned back to us and made an offer that chilled me to the bone. "Storm will pass by morning," he said. "You can leave then. Go back to your flatland people and your machines that measure what they cannot understand. Or you can stay, learn the old ways, become part of the mountain family that keeps the ancient knowledge alive." When we indicated that we wanted to leave, his expression darkened. "Mountain does not like to let go of those who have seen too much," he warned. "Your weather machines will never work right again. Your predictions will fail when the mountain decides to call storms, and someday when you least expect it, another storm will bring you back to us." We spent that night huddled near the cave entrance, listening to the voices of the cave dwellers echoing from deep underground and watching the impossible storm continue to rage outside. By morning, the weather had cleared completely, revealing a landscape that looked like it had been hit by a tornado despite the complete absence of any rotating wind patterns. Our research van was destroyed, crushed by falling trees and battered by hailstones the size of golf balls. Most of our equipment was either missing or damaged beyond repair. We hiked back to the main road and were picked up by a search and rescue team that had been looking for us since we failed to check in the previous evening. The official report documented equipment failure due to unexpected severe weather, with no mention of the cave dwellers or their claims about controlling storms. Dr. Crawford requested a transfer to a different research program within 6 months and now works exclusively with computer models and satellite data. He has never returned to field research, but the cave dwellers' warning proved accurate. Over the past 2 years, my weather predictions have become increasingly unreliable, particularly when it comes to storm systems that develop over mountainous terrain. Equipment that worked perfectly for years now malfunctions at critical moments, and I find myself unable to explain atmospheric phenomena that should be routine to analyze. 3 months ago, I was tracking a storm system that was moving toward the Ozark region when it suddenly changed direction and intensity in ways that violated every principle of meteorology I had ever learned. The storm moved in a perfect circle around a specific mountain peak, maintaining Category 2 hurricane force winds for 6 hours before dissipating completely. That mountain peak was less than 10 miles from the cave where we had taken shelter. According to satellite data, the storm should have been impossible. According to my instruments, it should not have existed at all. But according to local residents who have lived in those mountains for generations, it was just another spring storm, no different from dozens of others they had witnessed over the years. I still work as a meteorologist, but I no longer trust the science that once seemed so reliable. Weather patterns in mountainous regions follow rules that are not written in any textbook, controlled by people who have learned to work with atmospheric forces in ways that make our most advanced technology look like children's toys. The Ozark Mountains have been home to human communities for thousands of years, long before weather satellites and computer models attempted to predict and control the forces of nature. Some of those communities never forgot the old ways of reading signs in the sky and calling storms when they were needed. They are still there, living in caves and underground passages, maintaining knowledge that modern science has dismissed as impossible. And sometimes, when atmospheric conditions are right, and the mountain decides it needs new members, they send storms to guide the lost ones to their door. My name is Phoenix Anderson, and I have been a professional wilderness photographer for over a decade. My specialty is capturing the raw beauty of American forests during extreme weather conditions, particularly winter scenes when the landscape transforms into something almost otherworldly. The assignment that brought me to the Appalachian Trail in February of 2023 was supposed to be the culmination of my career. A month-long photography expedition documenting winter wildlife adaptation in the most remote sections of the trail system. I had planned the trip for 2 years, studying weather patterns, wildlife migration routes, and topographical features to identify the most promising locations for capturing unique images. My route would take me through sections of the trail in Virginia, West Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina, focusing on high-elevation areas where snow and ice create the most dramatic photographic opportunities. The expedition began in Shenandoah National Park on February 3rd, when temperatures were hovering around 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and fresh snow had fallen for 3 consecutive days. Perfect conditions for the stark, minimalist compositions I was hoping to capture. I was carrying winter camping gear rated for temperatures down to -20 degrees, plus over 40 pounds of camera equipment designed to function in extreme cold. For the first week, everything went according to plan. I captured images of frozen waterfalls, snow-laden branches creating natural sculptures, and wildlife tracks crisscrossing pristine white landscapes. The cold was brutal but manageable with proper clothing and shelter. I was averaging about 8 miles per day, stopping frequently to set up shots and waiting for optimal lighting conditions. It was during the second week, as I entered a particularly remote section of trail in West Virginia, that I began finding the unusual tracks. At first, I thought they were made by a large dog or possibly a wolf, though wolves had been extinct in this region for over a century. The prints were roughly canine in shape, but significantly larger than any domestic dog breed, with claw marks that extended unusually far from the toe pads. But as I studied the tracks more carefully, photographing them for documentation purposes, I realized they showed characteristics that did not match any known animal. The gait pattern was wrong for a quadruped, showing irregularities that suggested the creature sometimes walked on 2 legs rather than 4. The depth and distribution of weight suggested something much heavier than any dog or wolf, yet the tracks showed intelligence in their placement, deliberately avoiding areas where they would be easily spotted. I followed the tracks for over 2 miles, fascinated by the photographic opportunities they presented, and curious about what kind of animal could be creating such unusual prints. The trail led me off the main Appalachian Trail onto what appeared to be an old logging road that had been abandoned for decades. The tracks became more numerous here, joined by others that suggested I was following not just one creature, but several. The logging road ended at what had once been a clear-cut area, now partially reforested with young trees and dense underbrush. In the center of this clearing was a structure that defied immediate explanation. It appeared to be some kind of shelter, but constructed using techniques I had never seen before. Large logs had been arranged in a complex pattern, partially buried in the earth, with spaces between them filled with smaller branches, leaves, and what looked like animal fur. But it was the size of the structure that truly shocked me. This was not a simple lean-to or hunting blind. It was easily 20 feet in diameter and appeared to extend underground, as if the visible portion was only the upper level of a much larger dwelling. Most disturbing of all was the smell emanating from inside, a mixture of rotting meat, unwashed bodies, and something else that made my stomach turn. I approached cautiously, camera ready, professional curiosity overcoming the growing sense of unease I was feeling. The entrance to the structure was partially hidden by hanging strips of bark and animal hide, but I could see that it opened into a much larger space than the exterior suggested. I took several photographs of the construction, noting the sophisticated engineering involved in creating such a stable shelter using only natural materials. That was when I heard the breathing, deep rhythmic exhalations coming from somewhere inside the structure, too loud and too slow to be coming from any normal-sized animal. I froze, camera still raised, trying to process what I was hearing. Whatever was inside that shelter was large, and it was awake. The breathing stopped suddenly, replaced by sounds of movement, scraping and shuffling that suggested something large was rising to its feet. I backed away from the entrance, instinct screaming at me to run, but professional habit kept me focused on documenting what I was witnessing. What emerged from that winter den still haunts my nightmares. It was humanoid in basic shape, but changed by years of adaptation to extreme cold and harsh living conditions. It stood nearly 7 feet tall, covered in what appeared to be a combination of matted hair and animal fur that had been deliberately attached to its skin. Its face was human enough to be recognizable, but distorted by malnutrition, frostbite damage, and primitive modifications, including filed teeth and scarification. But it was the intelligence in its eyes that terrified me most. This was not some mindless beast or person driven insane by isolation. This was a human being who had chosen to live like this, who had adapted to surviving in conditions that would kill most people within hours. It studied me for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. taking in my modern winter gear, my expensive camera equipment, my obvious status as an outsider. Then it made a sound that was part growl, part vocalization, clearly some form of communication directed not at me, but at others I could not see. The response was immediate. 3 more figures emerged from the den, each showing similar adaptations to extreme cold survival, but obviously part of the same family or clan group. They moved with coordinated precision, spreading out to surround my position with the practiced efficiency of pack hunters. The largest of the group, the one who had emerged first, stepped forward and spoke to me in English that was heavily accented and difficult to understand, but unmistakably human language. "You take pictures," it said, gesturing toward my camera. "Show other people where we live." The statement was not a question, but an accusation delivered with absolute certainty. I tried to explain that I was documenting wildlife and natural landscapes, that I had no intention of revealing their location or even mentioning their existence. But even as I spoke, I realized how hollow my words sounded. I was a professional photographer, and my entire career was built on sharing images of remote wilderness areas with the outside world. "Wintertime," the creature continued, "nobody comes to mountain. We sleep, save energy, wait for warm time. You bring other people, make us move again. Always moving, always hiding, never safe." That was when I understood what I was looking at. These were not people who had recently become lost or abandoned civilization. This was a family that had been living wild for generations, adapting to seasonal patterns that included winter hibernation-like behavior that allowed them to survive in conditions that would kill anyone unprepared for the extreme cold. The smaller figures were children, I realized, though their exact ages were impossible to determine due to their primitive lifestyle and adaptive modifications. They watched me with the same intelligent wariness as the adults, clearly understanding the threat that my presence represented to their survival. "Camera," the leader demanded, holding out a hand that was more claw than finger. "Give pictures." I had 2 choices: comply with their demands and lose weeks of work, or attempt to escape with my equipment and probably die in the process. These people had survived in conditions that challenged every limit of human endurance, and they knew this terrain better than any modern outdoorsman ever could. I handed over my camera memory cards, watching as the leader examined them briefly before passing them to one of the others, who disappeared back into the den. "We keep pictures," he said. "You go away. Never come back. Never tell people about Mountain Family." The message was delivered without obvious threat, but the implications were clear. They had dealt with unwanted discovery before, and they had methods for ensuring their continued secrecy. I was being allowed to leave because cooperation was preferable to the alternatives, but that cooperation was not negotiable. I left immediately, hiking back to the main trail in gathering darkness without stopping to set up camp. The temperature dropped to -5 degrees that night, and I barely survived despite having equipment rated for extreme cold. These people were living through conditions that nearly killed me even with modern winter survival gear. I completed my photography expedition but never developed or published any of the images that might have revealed the location of the winter den. The memory cards I had surrendered contained weeks of work, including some of the best winter wilderness photographs I had ever captured. But I never attempted to retrieve them or return to the area. 6 months later, I read a news report about search and rescue operations in the same area of West Virginia where I had encountered the hibernating family. 3 separate hiking parties had reported equipment theft and what they described as stalking behavior by unknown individuals. Local authorities concluded that the incidents were probably the work of drug manufacturers using remote locations for illegal operations. But I knew better. The mountain family was protecting their territory during the active season, using techniques that kept them hidden while discouraging others from exploring too deeply into their domain. They were not criminals or madmen, but survivors who had learned to live according to natural patterns that most people had forgotten centuries ago. I still work as a wilderness photographer, but I no longer seek out the most remote and extreme locations. I have learned that some places are meant to remain hidden, and some adaptations to harsh environments come at costs that civilized people cannot imagine. The Appalachian Mountains have been home to human beings for thousands of years, including people who chose to remain wild when others moved toward civilization. They are still there, following seasonal patterns that include winter dormancy periods that allow them to survive conditions that would kill most modern humans. They are patient, intelligent, and absolutely committed to remaining hidden from a world that would either exploit them or try to save them from a life they have chosen. And they have learned that the best way to maintain their secrecy is to ensure that anyone who discovers them understands the importance of keeping that discovery private. My name is River Blackwood, and I have spent the last 17 years working as a forestry specialist for the United States Forest Service. My job involves surveying remote woodland areas, documenting biodiversity, and assessing the health of old-growth forest systems that have remained largely untouched by human development. It is work that has taken me into some of the most pristine and isolated wilderness areas in the southeastern United States, places where the trees have been growing undisturbed for centuries. In October of 2021, I was assigned to conduct a comprehensive survey of an old-growth section of Cherokee National Forest that had been designated for potential inclusion in a protected wilderness area. The site was located in a remote valley approximately 15 miles from the nearest Forest Service road, accessible only by hiking trails that had not been maintained for over a decade. The assignment was supposed to take 1 week, documenting tree species, measuring trunk diameters, and photographing unusual specimens for the official report. I had completed similar surveys dozens of times before, and this particular location had been recommended by my supervisor as one of the most spectacular examples of virgin forest remaining in North Carolina. What made this forest different from other old-growth areas I had surveyed was the sheer age and size of the trees. Some of the chestnut oaks and tulip poplars were clearly over 400 years old, with trunk diameters exceeding 6 feet. The canopy was so dense that even at midday, very little sunlight reached the forest floor, creating a perpetual twilight that felt ancient and primordial. But it was the silence that first made me uneasy. In 17 years of forest work, I had never experienced such complete absence of wildlife sounds. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter, no insects buzzing. The forest felt empty in a way that violated everything I knew about healthy ecosystem dynamics. On my second day in the area, I began finding the markings. At first, I thought they were natural scarring from lightning strikes or disease, but closer examination revealed deliberate patterns carved into the bark of specific trees. The marks were old, weathered by years of exposure, but clearly made by tools rather than natural processes. The markings appeared to be territorial markers of some kind, carved at precise intervals along what seemed to be established trails through the forest. Each marked tree displayed the same symbol, a spiral pattern that started small at the base and grew larger as it wound upward around the trunk. Following these trail markers led me deeper into the forest than my original survey area required. But scientific curiosity compelled me to document what appeared to be evidence of historical human habitation in an area that was supposed to be pristine wilderness. The trail markers led to a clearing that should not have existed. According to topographical maps and aerial photography, this section of forest was continuous canopy with no natural openings. But there it was, a perfectly circular clearing about 200 feet in diameter. completely hidden from above by an interwoven canopy of branches that had been deliberately trained to grow together. In the center of the clearing stood a structure that defied every principle of forest conservation I had been trained to uphold. It was a dwelling built entirely from living trees, their trunks and branches shaped and guided over years to create walls, roof, and floor without killing the trees themselves. The structure was still alive, still growing, with leaves and new growth emerging from every surface. The craftsmanship was beyond anything I had ever seen. Whoever had created this living building possessed knowledge of tree biology and growth patterns that exceeded anything taught in modern forestry programs. They had convinced dozens of trees to grow in precise directions, their branches interweaving to create spaces that were both architecturally sound and biologically healthy. But the dwelling was not empty. As I approached to examine the construction more closely, I realized that people were living inside the treehouse. I could see movement through gaps in the living walls and smell wood smoke from a fire that must have been burning somewhere within the structure. I called out, identifying myself as a Forest Service employee and explaining that I was conducting a routine survey. The response was immediate and terrifying. The forest around me suddenly exploded with movement as figures emerged from camouflaged positions I had not even noticed. They had been watching me since I entered the clearing, possibly since I first found the trail markers. There were at least a dozen of them, men and women of various ages, all dressed in clothing made from forest materials and moving with the fluid grace of people who had spent their entire lives in the wilderness. But what struck me most was their appearance. These were not primitive people struggling to survive in harsh conditions. They were healthy, well-nourished, and clearly thriving in their forest environment. Their skin was darkened by sun and weather, their hair was long and adorned with feathers and plant materials. But their eyes showed intelligence and organization that suggested a sophisticated society. The apparent leader of the group was a woman who might have been 60 years old, with silver hair braided with vines and wearing a cloak made from what looked like living moss. She approached me without fear or aggression, studying me with the same scientific curiosity I was directing toward her and her people. "You are the tree counter," she said in perfect English, though her accent was unlike anything I had ever heard. "We have been watching your people measure our forest for 3 days now." I tried to explain that I was conducting a biodiversity survey, that my work was aimed at protecting the forest from development. She listened patiently, then gestured toward the living dwelling behind her. "We have been protecting this forest for 7 generations, she said. "Our ancestors learned to live with the trees instead of cutting them down, to build with growing wood instead of dead lumber. Your people want to protect the forest by keeping humans away from it. We protect it by becoming part of it." She explained that her community had been living in this valley since before the Cherokee Nation was forced to relocate, that they had chosen to remain hidden rather than join the removal to Oklahoma. Over the generations, they had developed techniques for forest living that left no trace on the ecosystem while providing everything they needed for a sustainable lifestyle. The living architecture was just one example of their innovations. They had learned to cultivate wild plants in ways that increased biodiversity rather than reducing it, to hunt and fish using methods that strengthened animal populations rather than depleting them, and to create tools and clothing from forest materials without damaging the sources. But they also made it clear that their survival depended on remaining hidden from the outside world. Government agencies, environmental groups, and commercial interests would all pose threats to their way of life if their existence became known. They had survived by ensuring that anyone who discovered their community understood the importance of keeping their secret. "Your survey will recommend that this area be protected," the woman continued. "That is good. But your report will not mention us, and you will not return here again. We have ways of making sure the forest keeps its secrets, and we have used those ways before when necessary. The threat was delivered without hostility, but with absolute certainty. These people had remained hidden for over a century, and had clearly developed methods for dealing with unwanted discovery. I had no doubt that they possessed both the knowledge and the will to eliminate any threat to their security. I spent the rest of that day being shown through their community, observing construction techniques and forest management practices that revolutionized my understanding of sustainable living. They had created a civilization that existed in perfect harmony with the natural environment, taking only what they needed and giving back more than they consumed. Their knowledge of plant biology, animal behavior, and ecological relationships exceeded anything I had learned in graduate school or 17 years of professional experience. They knew things about forest ecosystems that modern science had not yet discovered, and they had used that knowledge to create a way of life that was both primitive and incredibly sophisticated. But they also made it clear that this knowledge would not be shared with the outside world. Their survival depended on remaining hidden, and they had learned through bitter experience that contact with modern civilization meant destruction of their way of life. I left the next morning with a complete understanding of why this forest had seemed so empty of wildlife. The animals were there, but they had learned to hide from human observers. The forest dwellers had trained them to avoid contact with outsiders, creating an illusion of emptiness that helped protect the community's secret. My official report recommended the area for wilderness protection based on the exceptional size and age of the old-growth trees. I made no mention of the human community or their remarkable innovations in sustainable forest living. As far as the Forest Service is concerned, the valley contains nothing but trees. But sometimes when I am conducting surveys in other remote forest areas, I find myself looking for signs of similar communities. I study unusual tree growth patterns and wonder if they might be evidence of living architecture. I listen for the absence of wildlife sounds that might indicate human habitation designed to remain hidden. The Cherokee National Forest covers over 600,000 acres of wilderness, much of it never fully explored or documented. There is room in that vast expanse for communities that have learned to live without leaving traces. People who have chosen to remain part of the natural world rather than trying to dominate it. They are still there, protecting the forest by becoming one with it, maintaining knowledge that could revolutionize our understanding of sustainable living. But that knowledge will remain hidden as long as the outside world continues to view wilderness as something to be either exploited or preserved, rather than something to live with as equals.